couches.
Yeah, yeah.
It's good practice. You know what the unit of measurement is called? Foot candles.
Good afternoon. As the Kai tradition, we're going to start promptly on time. I'm Brad Myers from Carnegie Mellon University, and a few people congratulated me on winning the award this year, but actually I won it 5 years ago, and it's my pleasure and honor instead to welcome you to the 2022 SIGCHI Lifetime Research Award talk by Yvonne Rogers, who's our winner this year. I'm standing in for Patrick Bowdish, the chair of the ACM SIGCHI Research Award Subcommittee, who normally would be introducing this award in the talk, but unfortunately is not able to attend Kai in person this year. The SIGCHI Lifetime Research Award is presented to individuals for outstanding contributions to the study of HCI. The award recognizes the very best, most fundamental, and influential research contributions. It's awarded, as the name indicates, for a lifetime of innovation and leadership and carries an honorarium of $5,000. The criteria for the award are cumulative contributions to the field, influence on the works of others, and development of new research directions. One of the benefits of the award, and it's really a benefit for us, the Kai community, is that we get to hear the award winner discuss their research in a format that's unconstrained by the narrow scope of a single paper talk. And that brings us to today's speaker. Yvonne Rogers is the director of the Interaction Center at the University College London, a professor of interaction design. Too early. That's next door. And the deputy head of the department in the computer science department. She formerly held professorships at the Open University, Indiana University, and Sussex University, and she has also been a visiting professor at the University, Cape Town, University of Melbourne, Queensland University of Technology, Stanford University, Apple, and UCSD. And she also has significant collaborations with a wide range of industrial partners and was awarded the Microsoft Research Outstanding Collaborator Award in 2016. Her PhD was from Swansea University, and her standing in the field is evidenced most recently by being awarded the Royal Society Milner Medal for Computer Science in 2022 and an MRC Science and Suffragette Award in Mathematics and Computing in 2020. But she was also awarded a Chair of Excellence from the University of Bremen in 2020 and elected to be a Fellow of the ACM in 2018, a Fellow of the British Computer Society in 2012, and has been a member of the SIGCHI Academy also since 2012. She was also awarded a prestigious UK EPSRC Dream Fellowship for rethinking the relationship between aging, computing, and creativity. She has nearly 500 publications listed in Google Scholar, where she's credited with almost 42,000 citations, putting her as the 16th most cited person in our field. She's a co-author of the definitive HCI textbook for the last 20 years, soon to be in its 6th edition, titled Interaction Design Beyond HCI, that has sold over 200,000 copies worldwide and has been translated into 6 languages. In her research, she's a pioneer in HCI and one of the leaders who created the field of ubiquitous computing in the early 2000s. She's recognized for the foundational research that investigates, invents, and designs technologies that extend and augment what humans can do. She has been instrumental in promulgating new theories such as external cognition, alternative methodologies such as in the wild studies, and far-reaching research agendas like the Being Human Manifesto. And she's also pioneered an approach to innovation and ubiquitous learning. And now, please help me congratulate and welcome Yvonne Rogers as she presents her talk on designing tech to empower us.
Thank you very much, and I'd like to thank everyone who has worked with me over the years, and I'm not going to retire just yet, as is the tradition. So it was really hard to think about what I might include in this presentation, because as you heard, I've done quite a lot in my career. And so what I've decided to do is to present my research journey, and the theme running through it is how I've designed technology to empower people. So I'm going to talk a bit about the work that I did in the beginning of my career at Sussex University on interactivity and the theory that we've developed. And then I'll talk about what I did at Indiana, which was working on tabletops and mobile technology. And then coming back over the pond to the Open University, where with Paul Marshall, who's here, we did a lot of research in the wild, and then what I've been doing at UCL. But I want to start off by one of the researchers who inspired me at the beginning of my career was Don Norman. And Don Norman wrote a book that everyone should read if they're studying HCI, which is The Design of Everyday Things. So Don was also a pioneer, and he was asked when CD-ROMs, do you remember those things? CD-ROMs came out where you could make your book to be interactive. And he was asked if he could put his books together and make an interactive CD-ROM. And I'm just going to play this video of what he did.
In Donald Norman's Defending Human Attributes, the man described as the gadget guru by the LA Times gives you a personal tour of the good, the bad, and the ugly of modern design. The program contains the entire text of Norman's 3 most popular books, with Norman himself offering critiques of everything from kitchen utensils to the computer itself.
That little tiny rectangle, the close box, you have to get the cursor exactly over it and click it in order to get rid of me. Very small, hard to reach, hard to hit. Bad design.
The toolbox allows you to move quickly to any...
So what I liked about that is Don had a sense of humor and still has a sense of humor, but he tried to think creatively about how he could make his book engaging. So when I got a copy of it, I didn't read the text, but I went straight to find the animations and the videos of him. And then we decided to give our students on the MSc a copy to see what they did. And sure enough, at the end of the class, the course rather, they all said that they found the videos of Don Norman being really engaging because it felt like he was having a one-on-one tutorial with them. And so I wrote a paper with one of my researchers at the time, Francis Aldrich, back in the 90s, which we called In Search of Clickable Dons. And it sustained their attention more by looking at them. None of them actually read the text. But what it did was make me think a bit about how do you design interactive media. And this was kind of very much, I think, in the 90s, what we were concerned with the technology of the day. And I was particularly interested in educational software and how we could make that interactive. But at the time, it was just terrible. It was a mishmash of images, sounds, dense text, and animations. And really not much thought had gone into how to make interactive multimedia. And people didn't really understand, how you might combine these and how that might improve and enhance learning. Instead, there were overly simplistic assumptions about how the different types of graphical representations work. And it made me cross. And many of you who know me, I can get cross about the bad design. So with my partner at the time, Mike Scaife, we set about trying to put the world to right. And we wanted to understand what interactivity was. There was nothing out there. And so this is when we developed our first theory of external cognition, where we came up with some ideas, some concepts and framework about interactivity. And I'm not going to go through this because that would take too long, but we came up with some design principles which we used to create and to inform our approach to designing interactive software. One of the earliest projects I worked on was to think about how we could teach children about food webs. And this is something that children find quite taxing. They understand that what certain organisms eat others, but they find it difficult to understand why we have these abstract food webs by which to explain how energy passes through. So we went about thinking about how could we design some software that kids could learn from. And we developed a series of modules where they could explore pond worlds and then try and map that onto the abstraction. One of the ones that we developed was called Bloodbath, and this is about number 3 in the modules. I'm just going to play it to you. But basically what they could do was they could watch organisms in the pond moving around, and then they had to decide where to put them on the food web. And
that's not right.
That's what happened if you put it in the wrong way. But then they could press play animation, and they could see what would happen if the weed ate the perch. So the kids absolutely loved this. They loved to put the things in the wrong place so that they could see what shouldn't happen. But through this, they learnt about why we have these types of abstractions. But also, in some of the other modules, we used deep voices and high-pitched voices, where it might say, "I'm a weed and I don't eat anything." And so they loved those types of silly voices. And it was one of our, as I said, first attempts at thinking about how you engage children and also how to make the software engaging. So we dared to think differently. We designed software which was quite different from what was around, and we based it on a principle which we call dynalinking, whereby changes in one representation are reflected in another. And this was what was happening in the pond. You could see what was happening in the abstraction. We also dared to design differently. So we added silly things like the bloodbath and the voices. And we also dared to involve the kids differently. So at the time, there was lots of talk about participatory design or user-centered design. And what we came up with was this idea of something in the middle called informant design, where they could tell us what things were silly, what things they enjoyed, what they struggled to learn. So that was our first attempt. But at the same time, this is what we saw, what was going on. In schools, it was very much, you had these banks of PCs where kids were just sat there completing tasks, uninspiring, predictable, boring, unimaginative, drill-based, exercise-driven. And they would mindlessly follow rather than mindfully reflect on what they were learning. And it simply didn't stretch them. So it was at this point, having had fun with the Bloodbath software, we then moved into what I'm calling playful learning. Where we wanted to push very different notions of learning, and we wanted to push the learning out of the classroom. And it was at this time when the desktop fell off the desk, and we were able to start thinking about ubiquitous computing and all the technologies you might use, mobile and pervasive. And so we started to think about how we could design active learning experiences that really inspired and engaged the children, and to think about it within the context of scientific inquiry. How could we get them to practice scientific inquiry and also to understand what it was about and how to enjoy it? And then from this to be able to reflect, integrate and generate their ideas. So this is when I, with a number of other universities in the UK, got a very large amount of funding from the British government to do what was called Equator. And this was thinking very much about how we design the physical with the digital. And from my perspective, I was involved in thinking about how we could really get kids excited in their learning. So we developed what was called the ambient wood. One of my colleagues at Sussex happened to have just bought a wood, and he said, "Yeah, sure, you can use it." And so we set about trying to wire up the woods so we could give the kids a field trip with a difference. And so we developed what we call digital augmentation, and this was trying to think about how you could couple various physical actions. It could be gesturing, talking, placing, probing, with digital effects. It was a very different way of conceptualizing interactivity. And we might have an animation that would play on a device, or a sound would appear in the woods, or an image would pop up on a screen. And you can see here, we also, rather than get them from the classroom, we brought the classroom into the woodland as well. So we were trying to bring these two together, and we wanted them to reflect and to be able to come back and think differently. So what we did, there were quite a number of us, designers, philosophers, engineers, computer scientists, is we spent quite a bit of time thinking about how we could design very new devices. Remember, this was before smartphones had ever come along, and PDAs were just appearing. And so with colleagues at Bristol, we developed what we called probing devices that we could collect readings of moisture levels and light levels. And also, we thought about how do we present this information to the children, and when would it be relevant and at what time? And then we would think about how do they do the reflection. So I'm not going to go through all of this, but I'm just going to mention one of the devices I think was very powerful, which was a probing device. And this was hand-built, which enabled kids to probe anything to find the light levels or the moisture levels. And you can see here one of the children in the woodland trying it out. And the way in which we designed it was that you either had a probing device or you had the display on which you could read it. You couldn't have them both together. And the reason for that is we wanted the kids to be able to collaborate, to come together and do this together rather than just going off by themselves. And so this is, you know, probing the ground, probing the air, and probing themselves. They often did that to see what the relative moisture and light levels might be. And then once they did that, they would come together and then decide, could we find something that was even wetter or even lighter? And so here's two girls using it together, probing the ground.
Yeah, it's much higher. Oh, right, so it's much wetter.
Think about it.
Put it here again. We didn't. Oh, no, that's exactly the same. Oh, right, because they're the same colour. Yeah.
So,
how about should we try dry leaf?
So they, after doing a probe, they then think about where they might go and why they might go there. Little did they know that every one of the probes that they had taken, and they did about 200, we could hardly get them back from exploring the woodland, had been recorded, and then we were able to present back all of them to them using this software bird's eye view of the woodland, which is where they had explored. And for them to reflect on why it was, you know, was that really damp there? Was that really light? And we found that they, you know, normally they find it quite difficult to, in that setting to talk to each other. We couldn't stop them from talking and predicting and saying, you know, things about all the different recordings that they had taken. And this at the time was, you know, quite revolutionary to sort of think about how you bring these together. So to summarize, this work, this early work, thinking about pervasive learning, I think we pioneered a very different way of designing interactive software, and we created these novel learning experiences that somehow brought the indoor and the outdoor together, and that they were able to, you know, learn more seamlessly. We experimented with what we call digital augmentation, which is to think about when do you present information, how do you allow children to get find things out for themselves. And I don't have time to go through all of those. And we wrote several papers that, on this work that I think have had quite an impact on those who have been thinking about how you design mobile learning and also use pervasive computing. At the time, my partner, Mike Scaife, sadly had a heart attack and died. And it was very hard for me to stay at Sussex. And so after about a year, when we finished the Ambient Wood project, I decided I would go off to the States. And somehow, I ended up in the Midwest. And I was offered a position at Indiana University in the New School of Informatics. And I literally went there with a suitcase. That isn't me, by the way. That's... And so it's, I had no idea where Indiana was, but one of the things I discovered was just how warm and kind the people are there. And they took me under their wing, and they looked after me, and really tried to help me to get established again. And I was lucky to meet some people who'd heard about Ambient Wood, And they asked me to get involved in a project which was called the Lily Arbor Project. And this was by environmental scientists who were working at the time, thinking about how do you restore floodlands in downtown Indianapolis. And they were experimenting with different methods of planting trees, and different types of trees. So they had 1 mile of this floodland by the White River in downtown Indianapolis, and they had planted different types of trees and different methods. And each year they would get volunteers and students to come along and measure how much these trees, there were thousands of trees that they had planted, and to see how much, whether they died, had someone eaten them, and had anything else come along and moved in. And they were doing this by paper and various instruments. And we got talking. I said, well, we can really, make this far more engaging, and the kids might get really quite excited about doing this. So this was the existing approach, which was twice a year in the spring and in the fall, they would go along and try and measure all of the different methods that have been developed for regeneration and restoration of this floodland. And each team was provided with various measuring devices, a map and a paper checklist. And they needed to first identify where the tree was, match it up, and then record various things about how it had grown or how it shrunk or how it had died, and add comments. And this would take a couple of days to get through all the 1 mile of trees. And when the students were asked why they thought that this tree had shrunk, they didn't really say much. So we came along and said, we can come up with some amazing software to help you out with this. So we developed our very first interactive PDA app, which was to try and think not just of giving them a digital form to fill in the data, a spreadsheet, but think about how we could encourage them and engage them in more scientific reasoning. And so this went through various iterations, but it provided a data entry page, a history of all the recordings that had been taken over the last 5 years, and then some pictures of trees that had been gnawed by various animals, and it could tell them whether it was a beaver or a deer that might have eaten them. And then if you can see in the top, this was the PDA, which is very clunky, but it had to be, because if you dropped it, it would smash. So we had to come up with some ergonomic aspects too. But we also thought about how do we encourage this sense-making and reasoning. So we designed some visualizations for them to look at, so they could see how the tree that they were measuring had grown or shrunk over the last 5 or 6 measurements, and then how it compared to the same tree in that area. So they could start to use that by which to reason. We also provided a messaging template where they could send messages to the other groups that were doing the reading. And so we thought, this is a great tool, but then we had, as all good researchers, thought maybe we've overdone it. Maybe we've given too many functions. Maybe it was going to be harder to learn how to do this. Maybe they would just be put off. Was it too complex? Or would it do what we hoped, which was to facilitate reasoning and more analysis? So what did we find? It took forever to get it set up. But we found that they used the combination of the graph pages, the data, and the information in the way in which we'd hoped. They were able to switch between them, and that facilitated their ability to reason why a tree had suddenly died, or why a tree had shot up, or why it was that something had happened. So we thought that we had been quite successful in creating a digital tool that enabled them to switch between observations and analysis. And we wrote a paper showing evidence of how the students in these groups were able to reason and think about why, and also the questions they asked. And what we did again was we didn't give each student one of these PDA devices. We gave one student one device in the group of 5 or 6 students to do the measuring, and another student one to look up the graphs and to see what information might be relevant at that particular point. So here is an example. By the way, if you're trying to do field work over a mile, it's really difficult to. So we rather than us running from one group to the next, we gave each group a camera to do the recording on, and so that gave them, I don't know what that's called, it's not autoethnography, but something like that. And here is an example of where they're doing the measuring, and one of the students is looking up and recording.
7.0.
Yeah. And you can make an estimate of maybe half. Or is it-
Yeah, that's what I was thinking.
What did we say for height?
7.
7?
But a big flower. 0.50.
The budding. Rejoice, the tree has resurrected. And let's look at the statistics in there and see how long that's been missing. It's just 1 year. So that'd be the middle tab. And we walk out.
Budding, you say?
Buddy, yes.
Are you still filling out the comments? This would be a good chance to test that.
Yeah.
We want to try and figure out when it died.
Yeah.
All right, one's dead, now alive.
Yeah. Yeah, now do, oh,
Huh?
go ahead and accept that. And then look at the stats page. Dead. Every measurement is
Wow.
Let's see.
How, for 5 years?
Actually, how did it like,
That's
we're not
hard
accepting it.
hard to believe.
This says they're only 8%.
Okay.
We're like 50%.
What a comeback.
Shouldn't I say one's dead now, alive?
Yeah.
Planted and never to be seen for 5
I
years.
could change that.
Yeah, I think it lost it.
So we collected loads of these vignettes, transcribed them, and were able to look at just how much hypothesis testing went on and the reasoning and the questions they asked. And it took forever, but we did get a number of publications out of that work that I'm pretty proud of. But just to finish off, when I was looking back, we discovered the students didn't want to text to each other. This was before texting actually existed. Because, as one of the students said, you know, I don't want to mess with messages. I want to be out here. I don't want to miss anything. If only that was true today. But you can see where they did. It was just the usual things. Lunch is ready. Come and get it. That's the kind of comments that they sent to each other. So I have always been very interested in how we can use the latest technology to engage students in their learning, to be self-initiated. At the time when we were out there in Indianapolis, I also met someone in Mitsubishi who was called Cha Chen. I don't know if she's here at the conference. But she had this amazing technology that I was really excited of, which was the Diamond Touch. And the Diamond Touch was one of the first tabletops that you could touch and have a number of people, well, 4 people round it, and be able to touch it at the same time and move objects. Again, now it just seems, well, what's the big deal? But that was before we had smartphones where you were able to do multi-touch. There were a few that had been produced, and they were like gold dust. So I think some people at Stanford had got hold of one, and then perhaps Berkeley. And so I had a nice dinner with Shah and said, hey, look, wouldn't you like to give one to Indiana University? And sure enough, she was, because that was when they were donating it, she donated one to me whilst I was at IU. And this is the sort of picture that was on their website at the time, which was, you know, businessmen sitting around discussing, these I think were architects or engineers, and being able to move and use it to collaborate and to manipulate information. And the idea here was very much to promote you know, face-to-face collaborations and to take turns. Well, I thought, well, we could do that, but I was actually more interested in thinking about how I might use it to support novel collaborative workplaces. So when I got it back to Indiana, I put it into my very empty lab at the time, and I had no problem getting participants to come along because it was such a novel technology. They all wanted to have a go on it. So we did lots of experiments looking at how we could support collaboration, and particularly we're really interested in, sometimes when you're in a small group, one person dominates and the others are a bit quiet, and we thought maybe this technology could change that. It could facilitate more equitable working. So this particular Diamond Touch, there's software on it that you can spin around, and you can stretch and move the images in quite interesting and novel ways. So I set about thinking about how I could extend this into the room, and to think about how we might support more equitable collaboration. So what we did, and this was with Richie Hazelwood, who now works in Amazon. He was a very good research fellow, let's just put it like that. And he helped me to build up this setup where we had the tabletop where you could move things around, but we then also had physical and tangible devices, or objects rather, and artifacts that you could bring to the table. So at the time, you could just manipulate digital images, but we thought if you could just extend it, so you could select things from the wall and decide whether you wanted to add them to the tabletop, or you could have these little 3D models of objects, and you could add those. And so what we wanted to do was to see whether or not extending the tabletop in this way could allow for more participation. So we spent a lot of time working out how to run a study to try and test this. And the way in which we did this was we had that set up with the physical and the tangible devices. We had just the tabletop, which was just where you could manipulate the images. And then we had a control condition, which was a laptop with 3 people sitting around it. And we asked the groups if they could design a garden on this tabletop using there were various types of plants or trees or objects that they could put in it, and that the garden should be for 4 seasons. And our theory, or rather our expectation, or rather our hypothesis, was that the tabletop plus the tangible and cards would encourage the most equitable participation, whereas just having the laptop would constrain and make it more difficult for them to equally participate. So we ran the experiment. We got lots of groups to come along and design amazing gardens on this, and to use the different things. So what do you think we found? Well, we collected lots and lots of data. We did videos. We were able to collect what they touched, and also what things that they moved around. And we spent hundreds of hours doing meticulous video analysis, hoping that we'd be able to show more equitable participation. So we had to think, what things could we look at? Well, we looked at turn-taking, we looked at the number of utterances, participation levels, we classified the utterances, and more and more. And one of my colleagues at the time, Yun, almost despaired at how much we had to do in order to try and show that there was better participation, or more equitable. And the findings were quite disappointing. We didn't find many differences between the 3 conditions, but what we discovered was a statistical analysis called the Gini coefficient, which I think Paul discovered. And this helped us to show that there were differences. I'm not going to go through what the Gini coefficient is, but it did help. And we found that there was more equitable participation. People in the extended tabletop condition did actually move around more, and all of them participated by adding more to the design, or removing it, or discussing why they had added it. So I think from this, other than pulling our hair out at doing so much painstaking analysis, we came up with this concept of entry points, but also we talked about constraints. So I developed a framework with my colleague to think of how you might design these types of digital physical spaces in order to encourage different kinds of things like more equitable participation. So whilst I was in the Midwest, I had lots of time on my hands. And I did quite a bit of theorizing, and some of you, as Brad has already mentioned, I wrote a lot about theory, the HCI theory book. Yesterday I was at a workshop on self-determination, theory, and we talked about the role and function of different theories and why does HCI still import so many theories. So that was kind of interesting to think about. I also, as Brad mentioned, persuaded people at Microsoft to bring some of the greatest and good at the time in HCI to a wonderful place in Spain to discuss the future of HCI, what it was that was important, what values were important. And from this, we developed this book called Being Human, which has been quite influential. And then I also was in one of my angry phases where Mark Weiser had his vision of calm computing, and I was perplexed at why everyone thought that was a good idea. And so I wrote a paper saying, moving beyond Mark Weiser's vision. And that one has been very influential in terms of getting people to think that you don't have to always take the status quo, what everyone is thinking at the time as to what we should be doing with the field. You can actually say, no, we need to be doing something else. And my perspective there was to think very much about we should be engaging people rather than designing technology to calm people. So that was something. A few years ago, Nottingham had a conference workshop which was halfway to the future, and I was invited because of that paper that had been influential. So it was really nice to see that. So thank you, those in the audience from Nottingham. My file was very large, and I was worried that it might not work. So I'm now going to shut this one down and open the next one. If you'd like to just stretch your arms, we have like a 30-second break. So as much as I loved the Midwest and the people there, I found it quite hard. I was quite lonely, and it was very cold in the winters and very hot in the summer. And so I decided I would, after 3 or 4 years, perhaps it was time for me to return to the UK. And I was offered a job at the Open University, but it's one you can get from PowerPoint now on the images they provide. So I quite like to think that was me. So I joined the Open University for 5 years from 2007, and this was the building that they built for me to entice me to come back. It's called the Jenny Lee building, and it was all, coloured glass and open space. It was a wonderful place once you got used to being in open plan. Anyway, again, I came back literally just with the diamond touch this time and my suitcase. And this is where we continued doing work on the tabletop. And as you can see here, that's Paul Marshall in the middle there. And we applied for various funds, and we got a number of grants to look at this. One of them was called Share It. And again, we worked looking at how we could get kids to collaborate more around the tabletop. We also thought about how we might put these out into the wild. So a lot of the research we did was based on doing things in the lab. The technology at the time was a bit unreliable and clunky, but then along came Microsoft Surface and Smart tabletops. And they were more robust. We were able to take them out into the wild. And that's another part of my research, was one of those turning points, which was, I've enjoyed doing these lab experiments, and we've been able to come up with new findings and new theories about what's going on in collaboration. But I really wanted to make an impact on the world, and I really wanted to see whether or not what we'd found in the lab was what we were could find outside in the real world. And so we designed various things that we could put out into the real world and to see what might happen. And also we wanted to think about, well, what things could we address? What kinds of problems society might have that we could use these technologies for? So we talked a lot about how we might improve physical health. We also thought about how we might reduce energy consumption. And there were lots of projects that we did at the Open University. It was one of my happiest times in that I didn't have to do any teaching. And I was able to get together a good team who were also like-minded. So I'm going to just mention 2 projects from my time at the Open University. And one of them was to try and encourage people to take the stairs rather than the lift or the escalator. And we were also interested in which theory might help us to think about how we might design technologies to do that. So at the time, we looked around at what sorts of interventions had been developed to try and encourage people to not just always take the elevator. And you can see this type of signage was very rude, very emotive in your face, which was, if you can see from it, if you take the stairs, you'll get thin, but if you take the elevator, you'll put on weight. And it plays on people's weaknesses and guilt. And we really didn't like that approach. We wanted to think about how we could be more playful and subtle in a way in which we might encourage people at the point of decision making to decide not to just take the lazy route. So at the time, ambient displays were all the rage, and we were also very interested in how we might use ambient displays by which to encourage people to think about what they were doing. And we wanted to influence them rather than persuade them. And we spent a lot of time thinking about our framing of this, particularly because we were going out into the wild. And so this is our approach, which is to think about what's the problem domain, what was the real world context, and what was the particular behavior that we wanted to target. Then we looked at different theories in the field that might influence and shape how we went about it. And we borrowed from social psychology and behavioral science. And with this came up with specific techniques that we might use in order to design new technology interventions. But because we were going in the wild, we also thought it was really important to think about the ethics of what we were doing, which is why that's bright yellow, and to engage with the communities and people who were trying to change their behavior. And at the end, the idea was to design salient information through these ambient displays for behavioral change. And one of the projects was in that lovely building that was built for me, where we thought very much about how we might use these ambient displays. And the paper, or the project rather, was called The Clouds. And I'm going to let myself from 10 years ago, or 12 years ago, do the talking. The idea behind the Clouds project is an investigation into ambient information displays and how we can use these to change people's behavior. And in particular, we're interested in changing people's behavior at the point of decision making.
Clouds is an Open University research project funded by the EPSRC. You can see that a large typical display has been set up that's giving different feeds of information depending upon what they choose to put on it. But also in this space, right up in this area, will be our large ambient display. Our large ambient display is going to also be sort of pumping a constant feed of information, but the piece of information is going to be much smaller. Our ambient display is going to simply be telling you, are people using the stairs or the elevator? And the more that people use the elevators, the higher the orange cloud of spheres rises, and the more people that are using the stairs, the higher the gray cloud of spheres is rising. And so walking in the building, someone can quickly glance and have this single piece of information given to them whether they wanted it or not. As people enter in through the Ginny Lee building, the first thing that they're going to notice is right up in this airspace, there's going to be this large collection of spheres hanging. This is the first point of decision that they make, whether they're going to either go into the central atrium or either head to the upper floors or into the other offices. As they veer in this direction, the floor sensors will detect that they're going this way, and that's when the LEDs will begin to light up along the carpet. The pattern of motion will be acting as a sort of subtle lure, suggesting if you're going to the upper floors, perhaps you should take the stairs. As they walk in this direction towards the stairwell, they'll sort of get a bit of a reward in the sense that the LEDs will begin to spark up faster and faster and faster. But if they step off the path in this direction towards the elevator, the entire series of LEDs will change to sort of a red glowing field. As that pulse of red sort of suggests that the carpet is a bit upset that you didn't take its suggestion to take the stairs, and it's a bit disappointed that you're taking the elevator.
That video goes on for a while, but I should point out that we weren't allowed to implement the red because people found it was a bit upsetting that the carpet was being angry with them. So And this is where, taking into account and talking to people is important rather than your great design ideas. So what happened was one weekend, Richie and various others went in and, when there was no one there in the building, implemented these displays, and it was quite an undertaking, but that's another story. But so then when we came in on Monday, we wanted to see what people noticed and whether they said anything. But we discovered that hardly anyone knew what the clouds meant. We didn't say anything. We just wanted them to notice and to think, why is there orange and grey and what do they represent? And what it did was it provoked loads of discussion amongst people, which was a great thing because it got them thinking about their relationship with the building and how they moved around it, and all the conspiracy theories about what they represented. And it created this buzz in the building. The twinkly lights, on the other hand, everyone loved them. And they said, look here, there's a door here to the stairway. They're like a landing strip guiding you to the stairwell. They made me say, ooh, pretty. Stars dropped from the sky, sparkle up your day. When we had to maintain them after a few weeks, people got really upset. They thought they'd gone. They got so attached to these twinkly lights in the carpet that it was very much almost like a pet that had become to them. So how did we go about finding out whether this was effective at changing behavior? Well, we had put sensors in the underneath the carpet pads at all the different stairwells and where the elevator was. And so we spent some time just measuring and recording how many people stood on these. We did this before and then afterwards. And we were able to show, with this log data from the pressure pads, there was a significant difference in terms of what people did before and what they did afterwards, so that the number of people taking the stairs increased over time. And we did this over actually a year, but for the paper, this was just for 2 months before and 1 month before. And this was, at the time, most studies were like for a week or something. And so we were managed to have this more longitudinal study of how it changed people's behavior over time. But we were puzzled because when we asked people whether they changed their behavior in terms of how they used the building, 93% said no, they hadn't changed anything. And so this conflicted with the data that we'd collected. And it suggests that maybe ambient displays are influencing our behavior without us realizing. And we left it like that in the paper because we have no evidence as to know why what people say and what they do don't actually match up. But that was one of my projects I really liked. I think the balls or the clouds have gone, but the chassis that we had to put up is still there because no one really knows how to take it down. And all of us who worked there have moved on. So anyone who is here from the Open University, we can tell you how to remove it. What I want to do now, though, is another project I was really proud of, and this was with John Bird and various people from Goldsmiths. We were working with them, again, to think about how we might change people's behavior. And the behavior that we were interested in this one wasn't in terms of getting people to walk more, but it was in terms of their energy consumption, particularly their electricity. We thought rather than asking, designing technology for individuals, we wanted to do it more at the community level. And so I used to live in Brighton in a street called Tidy Street. And Tidy Street is very community-based, and they have lots of street parties. They also have artists come along and do various installations. And this one, it's a terrace street with all terrace houses. One of the artists, Lisa Cray, had asked people who live in these houses to come up with a photo that she could blow up to put as a light box so that they would shine someone that was meaningful to them or something from their history. So as you walked along, you'd be able to see these, and think about who was that person and why. So we had this clever idea, because we've been reading about social norms, to capitalize on using this and to use social norms by which to show people's energy consumption. And what we thought about was that every resident in the street could show how much they were using relative to the rest or the average of the neighborhood. So those who were using above were having too many showers, there would be a red line. Those that were using below would be like a green line showing that they were using below the average, and those that were using average, it would be just yellow. And we thought that this might help people to reflect and think about it, and if they were using too much, to try and reduce it. But that idea was a no-no as well. Partly our partners, Bill Gaver and his colleagues, really didn't like that idea at all. They didn't like the idea of using social norm. Also, the people living in the street were very uncomfortable about publicly displaying their electricity consumption. They didn't want to be nagged or nudged or made to feel bad. And that's where we listened and we thought about, yeah, well, maybe social norm theory isn't quite right here. And they wanted instead a public display that could encourage a sense of community. So we looked at various different displays, but in the end, and this is down to John Bird and some other researchers, we came up with this, I think, was a brilliant idea of still using social norm theory, but in a very different way, and was to think about the use of electricity in Tidy Street relative to the rest of Brighton. And our final design was to have this graph in the street of showing how much the street was using relative to the rest of Brighton. And it was a chalk graph that was done the whole stretch of the road. And we got, someone was very interested in our project, a documentary maker, and he, I think, captures quite eloquently the project. So I'm going to let the video play.
We were interested in doing a public display, so we decided that we would turn the street, essentially, into a big graph. On the street, we show how the average usage of the participants compares to the Brighton average. It's 500 feet long, we record it for 3 weeks, and each day we show how they compare. So if you're looking down the street, you can see how their electricity usage has changed over time.
It's woken us up. I'm not very technological, is it? So I did my best, and I'm trying to unplug things and so on, but it has made us very conscious of what we, what we use, what we waste.
It wasn't really so much about the numbers as where your wiggly line was going in relation to the street's wiggly line. Seeing the information graphically really focused you into thinking about things that you leave on, that you don't need to.
Mine was quite high, so I needed to, in the community spirit, try and get that down rather than bring the street average out and above. So I started changing the way I did things.
One other piece of technology that we gave the participants was an appliance meter. I think that was really important for them because once they got an idea of how their overall electricity was changing, they then wanted to identify which particular appliances were using more electricity.
We'd see just how greedy some of the devices we had in the house were. Halogen lighting, very, very greedy. Television, not so bad. The kettle, we have to ration the number of cups of tea that we have every day because it uses up so much electricity. But it does make you very aware of what you're using.
Everybody that walked by, you could see them examining the street art, trying to understand what it was.
There was a lot of conversation that went on in the street. When you met something, you were always talking about the project. When people were walking down on a Saturday, they wanted to talk about the project. So I think it genuinely raised the profile, having this thing in the road.
So from that video, you can see how this public display very much involved the local community, and they had tremendous pride of being part of this project. And it was a daily reminder for them, seeing each day there would be another part of the graph would be sprayed at 5 in the morning, showing just how much. So they would look forward to seeing what that might be. But it led to interactions with many passers-by, and they became champions of the project. They would go out on the street and talk to passers-by about what it all meant. And they also all reported an increased awareness of their electricity usage. Some of them couldn't change their electricity usage. For example, there was someone who was on a dialysis machine, but he was able, to feel part of the project, even though he couldn't reduce his because of the need for the machinery. And that didn't matter. In fact, he actually felt very much still part of the project. Participants, did they reduce their electricity? Yes, we found on average 15%, which was quite high compared to other projects at the time, which were reporting about 6%. And the big question was this decreased electricity use is sustained after 3 weeks, because that's as long as the road, and we ran out of space. So again, after 6 months, we still found that some of the participants were continuing to record their electricity usage. And some of these had shown a significant reduction over 6 months still. Unfortunately, the rain did wash away the graph after a few months, and that disappeared. But I think it really did capture the imagination of the people in the street and the people in Brighton. It also went all over the world. We got lots of people asking if we could go and do the same in their cities. So it's an example of community engagement where people living in the street became champions and explainers, and it attracted the wider community. So kids would tell their teachers what was going on, and then they would tell other people. And it just went viral in ways that we could only dream of at the time. There was huge press coverage and social media. And it was very much accessible. It didn't make people feel guilty or anything like that. They felt that they were doing something for the community. Then, after 5 years at the Open University and doing some really great projects, I got an email from one of my colleagues at UCL, said, we've got this chair coming up in interaction design. Would you be interested in coming along? And it didn't take me very long to think it's time to move, and I would always liked UCL and thought that would be a great place to go next. So I joined in 2011, and this is what I built, which is a lab where people come and make things and work together and collaborate. In my first year, as Brad said, I got what was called a dream fellowship. And this was meant to give me a year to go traveling around the world to dream up my next biggest ideas. But within a few weeks of thinking about that, my boss said to come to his office. And he said, Yvonne, I've got a little project for you. And I said, oh yes, what's that? It says we're getting some funding from Intel to build what was called an ICRI, which is, I can't remember now, Collaborative Research Institute, interdisciplinary. And it's with Intel, and it's also with Imperial. And this will be a 5-year project, and it's going to be lots and lots of funding in it. Intel did this with a number of universities in the US, but we were the only one that was asked in the UK. And I said, I don't know anything about cities. It's not my area of research. He said, it doesn't matter. It's about the user engagement, the community side. So with Julie McCann from Imperial, we built up a very large team of about 12 PhD students and about 10 postdocs to work on how could we design sustainable cities and make them more connected. I even had to go to number 10 Downing Street. There was no parties on at the time. But it was one of my moments. So I had to put my dream fellowship on hold for a while, and I couldn't just go off for a year. I had to do it in small bits. But I did go to Cape Town and Australia, and I had some wonderful times there. So I'm just going to finish off with one project from that. We had many projects, many fantastic student PhDs that came out of it. But the one I want to talk about was how we thought about data that you might collect and use in quite different ways. And this goes right back to my theme, which is how can we empower people, particularly citizens, with the new sensing technology which was around at the time. So there was a lot of talk about smart cities, and it troubled me because we didn't really want to make the city smart. We wanted to make people smart. So we, having done lots of these community-based projects, decided to think of how we might do a bottom-up approach rather than top-down and increase people's awareness of what they care about and then let them discover more about their homes and environments. And the project was called PhysiKit, and this was a number of postdocs that had come along to work on this. And we wanted to make data more tangible. So to start off with, one of the PhDs had been working on what was called Smart Citizen, which was a device that you could sense all sorts of things, CO2, noise, NO2, and you could put it in your home and then collect that data, and then it would appear on a website, and you could click on it, and you could find out all the data that had been collected about your house, but then you could find out all the data that was being collected about other people's houses. It was all open source, and it was this dashboard. So you could see what was happening in the States and in Australia, and just, you know, have this wonderful tool. But what we discovered was that most people kind of played with it once or twice, and then they didn't bother. It was, when we talked to them about that, they said, well, it's too difficult. We don't understand what these graphs mean, or these squiggly lines. And that got us thinking is, how do you make that kind of data accessible to people who aren't data analysts? So rather than doing this, we thought a lot, and this is down largely to Stephen Huben, who was working on the project to think about tangible interfaces. And he came up with this idea of PhysiCubes, and some of you might be familiar with this, but we created a lot of these cubes that could have LED lights on, or they had discs on that moved, and that we thought you could put these as artifacts in your home, and that they would be triggered by something that had been sensed. So this one was PhysiMove. It has a disc at the top that might move around based on what had been sensed. So the idea was that these cubes would be connected to the citizen sensor, and that the people would then come up with rules about when they might be triggered. So we developed this end-user programming setup here, which was pretty straightforward to use, so that people could come up with their own rules about what was of interest to them. So an example would be if the CO2 level is equal to exhaled breath, then alert me by turning on the PhysiMove cube. So they could come up with all sorts of these rules. In the interest of time, I'm just going to whiz through and just say that we developed about 10 of these sets of cubes, and then we gave them to households to see what they would do with them, along with the citizen sensor kit. So first of all, they were just given the smart citizen and see what they do with it. Then they were given the PhysiKit, and then we observed the number of rules that they made and where the cubes were placed in the house. And also, what were they interested in? So just to very briefly touch upon some of the findings, we found that they really liked making their own rules, and they really liked to think about where they would put them in the house and which one mapped onto the sorts of information they were interested in. So the one that had the cog on the top was considered to be the most interesting, and they put that one on the carbon monoxide. It would go faster as it rose. You could see the difference. And this, they discovered, was when there were more people in the room, they would be exhaling CO2. So in the paper, we talk about how they were appropriated, these devices, and how it made people interesting in the sorts of things that were being sensed. And then for them to think about, perhaps we might open a window, we might do this or do that. So it was a way, an entry point, if you like, into what was very complex data, that they didn't really need to know all of that. They could look at it, but these were just enough to let them know that certain things were changing in their homes. And so we came up with a number of design principles, and that led to other projects thinking about how you can use tangibles in quite different ways to think about data. And I'm just going to rush through to say that it led us to think very differently about data, and we then start to think about what other things we might do, how we might visualize data and think about the privacy of it. And we created a diversity of physical interfaces. And I don't have time to go through these. I'm running out of time. But I just want to say that after that project, we carried out a number of community-based projects where we thought about how you can use these sensing technologies in the home, in the environment, but you need to engage the community. So we did co-design and participatory design. We looked at how we might involve communities in developing new technology and digital interventions in a whole range of projects, including monitoring bats, recycling food waste, and even we went on the island of Madeira. Anyone here from Madeira? Oh, okay. We involved them in understanding mass tourism by being able to put these sensors out there. So I am running out of time, and I'm not going to go through that one. I'm just going to say what next. There are many projects I could have talked about that I really enjoyed, and I've loved most of my career in terms of being able to do things that are creative, that are exciting, that engage people, and really think about what the properties and affordances are of different technologies, but also to then reflect and to theorize about what it is that's happening. So, like many of you, during the pandemic, I got a bit sort of down and a bit depressed and a bit, I couldn't do what I'm usually doing. I had to sort of sit behind a screen and think and pivot and do things differently. We couldn't run studies, we couldn't go out. We had to sort of, do things at home. But now, I think, we're starting to get out of this hibernation. My lab was mothballed, and now it's starting to, come back to life, and some students are going down there. So I'm really excited about being able to continue with this research. But I think as I get older, my role is very much more to mentor people who are coming up, early career researchers, and sort of take, reflect and step back a bit. So I think that's what I'll be doing next. But I want to finish off by just thanking everyone who has worked with me in the different places. There are too many for me to go through and name them all, but those who are in the room will probably be able to see their names straight away. So these are people in Sussex and Indiana, but also at the Open University and at UCL. And I think there are many others who I've worked with who weren't at those places, but at different universities. And it's been a wonderful career, and I've had a fantastic time, and I just would like to thank them. And I'd also like to thank people who inspired me, like Don Norman, but also Ben Schneiderman, who's always been there to support me and encourage me. And so I'd like to thank, if I don't think they're here, them as well. And on that note, I'd like to thank you for being a wonderful audience, and hope to be able to catch up with some of you afterwards.
So, hi.
Hi.
So I'd like to say, first of all, really thank you for the talk and for inspiring me throughout my career. And I, want to specifically define the switch that you talked about, also shifting from lab study to in-the-field study is something that in HCI we see more and more movements towards it, but it's still very, very challenging. And I wanted to ask, what's next? What do you feel is the next shift that is maybe awaiting?
That's a very good question, and thank you for your comments. I think what we don't do good enough of is collaborating with other people from other disciplines. We did that, HCI was very much about being interdisciplinary. So there's been a lot of talk, for example, about human-centered AI. But to really do human-centered AI, we've really got to work with people in AI, and AI researchers have got to understand what we do. And I've been talking to people at the conference about how we might do that. And it's not easy because, we are sort of, very much thinking from our own mindset about, what does human-centered mean? And we understand explainability in a different way, perhaps from people in AI do. So I think that's one. But I think the real answer is it's up to people like yourself now to come up with the next big paradigm shift.
Okay, well taken.
Hi, Stephen Pemberton. It was great to see the article of the clickable dons, because in fact you published that in the SIGCHI bulletin when I was editor-in-chief, and I immediately recognized it and immediately went and looked at it again. It's great to see. About comparing your energy use to the average, I know of at least one other study that showed that there were certain people who, when they saw that they were below the local average, they thought, oh my God, we need to use more electricity because otherwise we look like paupers. And I wondered if you had any...
Yes, that's it. I mean, there has been quite a bit of research written about what's called the boomerang effect. That if you are seen to be using less than average, then you might think, well, I can use more, and then you go up rather than staying at that level. We didn't actually find it on the Tidy Street project. We found that what they wanted to do was they wanted to get onto the pavement, get across the yellow lines, and they were really, because it was a community effort, they didn't somehow get together and say, let's all use a lot more energy so that we go the other side of the street. So I think on an individual level or on a householder level, there's been research shown that yes, if you're using less, you think, well, I should be using more. Why should I be, skimping? So yes, that's called the boomerang effect.
Okay. Joe Constand, thank you so much for the talk, the reflection. I wonder if you could reflect on the state of practice and what it's going to take to bring this innovation to every day. At least my reflection when I go out there is that the actual systems that we're using are pretty dreadful, and that we've had decades of brilliant interaction research and not decades of brilliant translation of that into practice.
That's a good question, and that often taxes me as to why, because there are more and more HCI researchers working in these companies like Intel and other tech companies, and you'd think that they would have had more influence on some of these products. But I think some of these products, and what taxes me most is at UCL we have HR systems and expense claim systems which are absolutely terrible to use. And you think, they're sort of based on Oracle. You think, why is it that these still exist? Why is it that we haven't got better interfaces for these? And I don't know why it is that these companies are still sort of very sticking to this particular awful interface. And I think that's probably where Don Norman probably pulls out his hair, because he'd hoped 50 years ago to have shaped and influenced that in more ways. But that's something to, is it because it's cheaper? Is it too expensive to make these changes? Is it just too hard? Are these systems so complex and it's too difficult to kind of improve the interface? But I think I would say that some interfaces are much better. And I think a lot of apps have improved. I think Microsoft products are much better to use than they were a few years ago. And I also think, Google has done wonderful things and also Amazon. And who else is a sponsor? Meta have done great jobs. They have good teams to improve the interface. And Bloomberg, I think, is one who have really thought about the interface. So I think it varies as to why some systems persist to be really awful, but others have improved considerably.
Okay, congratulations, first of all. And I'll start with something you might find amusing, which is when I first went to the Jenny Lee building, those balls were still there. It was shortly after you'd gone. And I was asking, why are they there? And the answer I got from everybody was, something to do with Yvonne. We're not sure. We don't really know. So I thought that might be amusing. But I wanted to ask that you covered a lot of this data visualization, and you've looked at information visualization on collaborative displays and large public street display, and then with the PhysiKit, and I think also ambient displays. So what do you think is important in that about evoking curiosity of people towards the data? And do you think that this is something that is an important aspect of these different ways of presenting data and information?
Absolutely. I think all of what we've done is to get people to be, provoke them to be curious and to think about it. People find it quite hard looking at graphs and trying to understand what they mean. Even simple line graphs can be quite difficult. You can say, you can provide the context, but some of these just get them to think, well, what is that? Why is that? And how does that map on? And it helps people, I think, try and map that onto the underlying data. And so I think there is a pattern, or in a number of these projects, is to simplify, but then to allow you to drill down into the data once you understood the context and how it maps onto it. So that's with the PhysiKit. They were just simple ones. With the kids, they were able to see relative levels of light and moisture, but then they could see all of the data points and to think about how they, the patterns that they were creating. So I think it's something about making it simple in order, and also making it appealing, attractive, such that people, they get interested, and then you can start thinking about it rather than, oh, I don't know what this means. So yes.
Hi, congratulations, and thank you for a very inspiring talk. So I'm currently focusing as well on children and education, and one of the things that I kept seeing in your work is the combination of children thinking, reasoning, and education. And I wanted to ask you, what was the most surprising element while doing and being very closely working with children, and what would be good advice to get the most of that kind of interaction with children in your research? Thank you.
That's a question that I'm always thinking about is, why is it that kids like this, and why do I keep going back? So I didn't have time to go through one of the projects, which is we worked with the BBC a few years ago to help them think about physical computing and how to encourage kids to learn how to code. And let me just show you. That captures, for me, the excitement. That kid has been programming, coding, and putting this cube together to make animations and all sorts of things happen. And it's just a joy that she's accomplished something by herself. And I think that's something, is to give them more control over their learning, and more to be able to take the initiative, not to set them tasks, and but to really get them to be able to explore the environment, to get them to create things. So she had to create that cube first from pieces, then work out what all the different sensors could do, and then to sort of design and do the coding. And these cubes, we've done lots of public engagement events. We've gone to museums, we've gone to schools, we've worked with kids with special needs, and young kids and older kids, and each time what we try and do is think about how do we present these to them, why is it exciting, what can they do with these, and each time we find something different. One of my PhD students, Susan Leckel, spent hours and hours and days going and doing these public engagement, and that really helped her think about, what was it, why were these so successful? So I think one of the things is to get out of schools and go into the communities and museums and places where kids go, and to observe how they're using them and why they get so excited.
Okay, unfortunately that's all the time we have, but thank Yvonne again.
Thank you.
प्रविधिबाट बाहिर निस्किनको लागि यहाँ थिच्नुहोस्। यो प्रविधिबाट बाहिर निस्किनको लागि यहाँ थिच्नुहोस्। यो प्रविधिबाट बाहिर निस्किनको लागि यहाँ थिच्नुहोस्।
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, hi.
Hi, how are you? Can you do me a favor? Can you share your presentation? That'd be
Yeah,
great.
sure. So I will have a video. Let me check. So can you see it?
If you could play it so we can hear it.
Okay, I just started.
Say it one more
Hi
time.
everyone, my name is
Oh.
Anna Martin Niedecken and I'm absolutely delighted to... Works?
That works.
Cool. And can I maybe also try to then mute myself whilst the video is playing to just see if you still hear the video, but not me?
Sure. I don't.
Cool. So I just start playing it again. Receives the SIGCHI Outstanding Dissertation Award 2022. This wouldn't have been possible without all these amazing people and partners.
If you
Thank you all
muted
so
yourself, we
much
still
for your
hear the
guidance,
video.
inspiration. Okay, cool. So that works.
And if you want to go ahead and share your presentation so we can see that.
It's all in there. So it will just continue. So it's the whole presentation in here.
Okay, so will we start with you on Zoom first and then you'll roll the video?
I think so. But probably Josh will also say some words, as far as I know. And then it's a pre-recorded talk, which I will be then sharing, as far as I know.
Okay, so you actually won't physically talk yourself live. You're just going to share your video.
Right. But I guess I might be talking in the Q&A afterwards.
Okay, and then Josh is going to introduce you in advance. Okay?
Right.
Great. All right,
Cool.
I think we're set. Give me 1 second. So Josh.
Yeah, cool.
Okay, so does she know that? So you know that you're doing the Q&A right after your video plays, is that correct?
Right. So, and then I guess I will stop sharing my screen again and will then be answering potential questions, right?
Sounds great.
Cool.
Okay, so as soon as Josh introduces you, I will then go to your Zoom feed. I'll wait till he actually introduces you and he stops talking, okay?
Okay, and should I just leave my video on or should I mute myself and close the camera as well?
I would just leave your video on right now. Let's have it queued up, ready to go. We're about 15 minutes, 10 minutes from starting, correct?
Cool, yes.
Okay, terrific. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Hello, welcome, test, test, test. Welcome to this exciting session. We have two parts. The first part is going to be the outstanding dissertation awardees giving their talks. And then we are going to have the SIGCHI Academy inductees in a fireside chat. My name is Josh Andres from the Australian National University, and I'm also the SIGCHI chair for awards. Audience, please prepare at least one question for the audience, for the presenters. All right, let me introduce the first speaker, Annalisa Martin-Niedeken. In her PhD dissertation, Dr. Annalisa Martin-Niedeken applies theory and empirical approaches to develop and validate two extra games, Plunder Planet and Extracube. I can attest that Plunder Planet is great fun because she actually set it up at a Dash tool on body-centric computing, and I played this game, so I can really attest this is a really cool game. The games require developing and evaluating entirely new interaction and controller concepts by integrating knowledge from different scientific disciplines. The dissertation is particularly impressive because it attempts to make extra games into practical fitness tools that both provide sufficient intensity as well as promote long-term use, balancing fun and exertion. The awards committee also recognized Dr. Martin-Niedeken's spin-off company based on her research. Congratulations, Anna, and over to you.
Thank you so much, Josh, for this very kind introduction. And hi, everyone. I'm very happy to at least join you virtually. And I prepared a little video of my talk, which I'm very happy to share with you right now. So I'm quickly setting it up. And here we go. Hi everyone, my name is Anna Martin-Niedeken and I'm absolutely delighted to receive the SIGCHI Outstanding Dissertation Award 2022. This wouldn't have been possible without all these amazing people and partners. Thank you all so much for your guidance, inspiration, support and the most exciting collaborations. And now I'm very happy to tell you more about my PhD project. Insufficient physical activity has been considered one of the biggest societal challenges of the 21st century. Only those who exercise regularly and enough can maintain their physical, cognitive and mental health into old age. The main reasons for physical inactivity are a lack of motivation and time, changing behavioral and environmental factors, and a number of personal barriers. The call for new, easily accessible, attractive and effective exercise alternatives is growing louder. Exergames, digital games that require physical effort and are controlled by whole body movements, are often cited as possible answer to this societal problem. More than 10 years of interdisciplinary R&D work have already been dedicated to the exploration of the potential of exergames as an effective and attractive way to promote physical activity and training in different application areas. The key to a successful exergame is always assumed to be a balance between fun and exertion, or in other words, between attractiveness and effectiveness. The attractiveness of an exergame determines how motivated players are to play the game in the short and long term. If an exergame is attractive, this is reflected among other things in a good game experience. According to the dual flow theory, this is basically achieved when the player's abilities match the challenge of the game. Also, it is important that the design of the exergame corresponds to the taste of the player. The effectiveness of an exergame is reflected in measurable physiological and behavioral effects, such as an improved fitness level, better endurance, strength, speed, or coordination. An exergame is considered effective when the fitness skills of the player match the physical challenge of the exergame, which is ideally based on a real-world training concept. The effectiveness of commercially available and specifically developed exergames has been investigated in numerous interdisciplinary studies with different target groups. Findings indicate potential positive effects on the cognitive level, such as on the executive functions, on the physical level, such as energy expenditure, and on the mental level, such as self-esteem, motivation, and mood.
Additionally, exergaming is also known for its engaging and motivational potential, especially among less physically active populations. By providing an engaging audiovisual, narrative and immersive game scenario that matches players with a wide range of motivational types, exergames can enable a shift of the player's focus to the game experience, making it easier to engage in physically challenging exercise. So far, exergames have been successfully shown to have the potential to increase, for example, exercise adherence, long-term motivation or engagement. In addition to the promising indications that never translated into actual measurable effects, it was often concluded that the majority of the evaluated exergames neither achieved the required training intensity nor led to the intended adherence or long-term motivation. There are several possible reasons for this. First, the majority of exergames evaluated were not developed with the purpose of achieving a specific training goal or to be used as an alternative to traditional training tools. Second, neither the target audience nor an interdisciplinary team with experts from game design and sports science was involved in the design process to incorporate both specific user requirements as well as disciplinary specifications into the development. The goal of my PhD project was to contribute to a better understanding of well-balanced exergame design. In my work, which followed an iterative, interdisciplinary and user-centered R&D process using mixed methods, I explored and evaluated how different movement-based controller devices, exercise concepts, game adaptations and player modes affect the attractiveness and effectiveness of exergames. This resulted in both theoretical and practical contributions. As preliminary work for the contributions of my dissertation, we approached exergames from a theoretical perspective. We analyzed underlying multidisciplinary theories and concepts of exergames from relevant fields and built a generic framework which structured the findings based on three interdependent dimensions: the player, the game controller, and the virtual game scenario. We explored some commercially available exergames to verify the theory-based assumption that the interposition of technology brings specific transformations in the coupling of perception and action that do not occur in real sports situations. Among other things, the comparative pilot study showed that two different controllers, one gesture-based and one haptic device, which allowed for different physical input, were likely to induce diverse gameplay experience with differently skilled players. However, certain design-specific differences in the two exergame conditions meant that these results could only be interpreted as a first trend. To overcome existing limitations of the previous study approach, such as a non-identical game design and a very sport-specific movement concept, we worked with children and an interdisciplinary team to design Plunder Planet, an adaptive exergame environment that enabled a single-player and cooperative multiplayer experience using two different controller devices. In the first study of my dissertation, we compared the subjectively experienced attractiveness and effectiveness of Plunder Planet when played with different movement-based controllers. Besides the generally great acceptance of the exergame, participants reported that the haptic full-body motion controller provided physical guidance and a more cognitively and coordinatively challenging workout, which was better rated by experienced gamers with less athletic skills. This was also reflected in a significantly better game flow and enjoyment with the full-body motion controller. The gesture-based Kinect sensor was reported to feel more natural, allowed for more freedom of movement and provided a more physically intense but cognitively less challenging workout, which was better rated by athletic players with less gaming experience. The Kinect condition also resulted in a significantly higher average heart rate. Furthermore, we experimented with an exploratory adaptive algorithm that enabled the cognitive and the physical challenge of the exergame to be manually adapted in real time based on the player's fitness and gaming skills. The first and the second study of the dissertation also compared an adaptive with a non-adaptive single-player version of Plunder Planet. We could show that the adaptive version of the exergame was significantly better valued than the non-adaptive version with regard to game flow, duel flow, motivation and enjoyment. Finally, we were able to show in the third study that the specifically designed controller technology could be used as an enabler, supporter, and shaper of bodily interplay in social exergaming. We found that, compared to the Kinect sensor, the full body motion controller evoked significantly better feelings of empathy and engagement, as well as less negative feelings. Once we had a good understanding of the determinants of the attractiveness of an exergame design, the subsequent goal was to further explore the effectiveness of exergames, optimize the algorithm for adaptive game difficulty, and to explore further attractiveness and motivation-enhancing design approaches. To this end, we worked with adults and an interdisciplinary team to develop the ExeCube, a physically immersive and adaptive functional fitness game environment that enabled both cooperative and competitive exergame experiences. Again, the iterative user-centered design process was informed by findings from our previous studies. In the fourth study of my dissertation, we developed a coordinatively and cognitively challenging functional training protocol with scalable intensity and compared the subjective ExeCube experience to functional interval training with a personal trainer. The feasibility of the ExeCube training was demonstrated and gave signs of reaching a similar intensity to the personal training, but was more highly rated for flow, immersion, enjoyment, and motivation. Based on this exploratory comparison of the ExeCube with a personal trainer session, valuable avenues for the further design could be identified. Among other things, it could be proved that the player's focus during the ExeCube session was more on the game than on their own body. Players experienced stronger physical exertion and social pressure with a personal trainer and a stronger cognitive exertion and involvement with the ExeCube. We implemented a refined version of the previously tested adaptive algorithm and automated it for the first time for the purpose of this study. Again, we could show that the adaptive version had benefits with regard to the subjectively experienced attractiveness and effectiveness compared to the non-adaptive version and also to the personal trainer condition. Immersion was significantly better rated for the adaptive version than for the personal trainer condition. Regarding the challenge, the non-adaptive version was significantly less optimally and more insufficiently challenging than the personal trainer condition. To inform the design of a multiplayer version of the ExeCube, we explored different social play mechanics in the fifth study. This resulted in differently balanced experiences of social immersion, fun, as well as physical and cognitive exertion among participants. Moreover, we could identify promising new player formations. As the preliminary comparative evaluation of the subjectively experienced effectiveness and attractiveness of an ExeCube session and a personal trainer session could prove the general feasibility of the concept and revealed the first indications of the intensity of the ExeCube's training concept, we compared the objectively measured effectiveness of a single ExeCube session with a functional high-intensity interval training, short functional HIIT, with a personal trainer in a final 6 study and after another design iteration. Again, we also assessed the subjectively experienced attractiveness of both conditions. We could show that the ExeCube is a feasible training device for training at functional HIIT level. While physical exertion was slightly lower than in the conventional functional HIIT condition, the ExeCube condition's average heart rate reached the functional HIIT threshold and yielded significantly better results for flow, enjoyment, and motivation. The ExeCube training also resulted in a subjectively experienced higher cognitive load. To sum up, my work provides fundamental research and design contributions to the promising, yet still relatively unexplored field of exergames. In the meantime, my dissertation has laid the groundwork for numerous follow-up projects and studies, as well as for the foundation of my startup company. I hope my work will inspire more future R&D work in the field of exergaming, which is of great importance in the wake of the widespread lack of physical activity. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Anna is ready to take questions. There are no questions at this moment, but I'll ask you a question. What are some of the things that you had to, when you're preparing, moving from one game to the other game, did you have to unlearn something that helped you see clearly that other game to progress your research?
I don't know if I heard it correctly, but if the question was if I had to unlearn something,
Correct.
I guess, yeah, cool, okay, yeah. I would say yes. So from the first to the second game, it was definitely less playful in the beginning because we tended to switch over the focus more to the effectiveness side with the Execube and had it more on the playful side with Plunder Planet. So stepping one step back and really, rethink certain things was, I would say, the main difference between both games, which of course were very much relying on each other, or at least on the findings we were able to find out with the evaluations of the games.
Yeah, thanks very much. Yes, there is a question in the audience. Go ahead.
Hi. Thank you so much for your presentation. It was a really interesting set of studies. And I really like how you show the transition from lab-based to more, let's say, worked out technical settings. I was wondering how you see the next step to bring this to real-world context. And you mentioned you have a startup company there. Maybe I guess you have some idea how you put this, how you actually get real people to use this in everyday life.
Yeah, thank you so much for this question. And definitely. So the Execube has walked or passed through more iterations, and we are currently really selling it to the market. And there are real people moving in the gyms, in the Execubes, all over the world. So this is, I would say, the first step we already established so far based on all this R&D work. And of course, there are also a number of new R&D projects approaching us. So we are collaborating with international partners on also making it more accessible for the geriatric population, for instance, or even more inclusive in terms of, being more accessible also for people with certain disabilities on the physical or cognitive level. And we just ran our first season of the Execube League, which is, I would say, kind of a physical inclusive esports league, so to say, at the world's biggest fitness fair 2 weeks ago. So there are some plans.
Cool, thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you very much. I think there is a final question.
Yeah. Hi, Annalisa. This is Oliver.
Hi.
So right now I'm having a seminar called Gamification in Serious Games with my students. And one question they always have is, how important is story? I think with sport you have this problem where it needs to be very redundant. You don't change that much. I mean, you move in similar fashion all the time. So do you think that it is possible or even feasible, and would it make sense in some ways to tell a story, to try to create a narration? Or do you think it's just okay to use leaderboards and points and badges and achievements and the usual gamification elements?
Well, thank you so much for this question. I would say the answer lies in between both. So it's all about having a good narrative approach, which is not necessarily only focusing on the virtual world. This is very important because we, for instance, are experiencing a very strong fascination for a physically based narration. So really, as I just mentioned, the League, for instance, building a whole ecosystem around the game, a whole story around the game and the leaderboards. This is very powerful, but of course, if you would not really use certain aspects of a good story inside of your actual games, the users are very used to good stories using all the casual available games. So therefore, a little bit of a story in the virtual world is very important as well. But the answer, I would say, in the end, is in between.
Thanks.
Great. Thanks. Join me in congratulating Anna one more time.
Thank you so much.
And then Akash, you will get ready to set up your laptop too.
everyone. I'm Neha Kumar, and I had the pleasure of being on Akash Gautam's dissertation committee. I am here to introduce him. I will say that I'm a fan of Akash and his work, but also the dedication and humility with which he does it. And his advisor, Dr. Deborah Tater, has added that she's very sorry that she cannot be at CHI to enjoy this moment, but she sends this introduction. Dr. Akash Gautam is here today because of his doctoral work in computer science at Virginia Tech. We are lucky to have his research shaking the groundwork of what we consider inside and outside the purview of HCI, not only because of the work itself, which he will tell you about, but because prior to his doctoral studies, he also worked as a software development engineer at PayPal, and because his other research has already had important impact in software engineering and in reconceptualizing what it means to teach and learn computational thinking. He is changing our field by bringing new considerations into the bright circle of his regard and recognition.
Thank you, Neha. While I set this up, I just want to thank you all for joining me today, and give me a minute. All right. First of all, thank you, our committee, for this award. I'm honored by it. And before I begin, I want to thank a number of people who have mentored me and whose work has influenced this dissertation. First, my advisor, Deborah Tater, whose push to reflect our better nature in technology design has shaped the entire journey. I'm also grateful to members of my committee, collaborators, and mentors, as well as members of the third lab at Virginia Tech. Their support at various stages of the dissertation kind of got the dissertation out of the door. The particular context of my work involves an anti-trafficking organization in Nepal and the sex trafficking survivors who live in the organization's shelter home. Just to give you all a background of the context, Nepal is a major site of human trafficking. It is estimated that anywhere between 6,000 to 12,000 girls and women are trafficked annually. People rescued from sex trafficking are vulnerable in several ways. Most of them are young, they have limited formal education, many are shunned by their families, and they have very limited sources of social support. Most of their social support comes from anti-trafficking NGOs. NGOs provide survivors with a protected living home, some form of skill-based training, and support during reintegration. I've been working with one such NGO in Nepal for the past 5 years. Please note that in this talk, following Nepali practice, I shall call the women we worked with either sisters or sister survivors. The goal for the sister survivors is to achieve what they call dignified reintegration. Through our research, we aim to understand how we can design socio-technical systems that can assist the sister survivors to move towards their vision of dignified reintegration. Through an initial inquiry, we found that the organizations were reliant on international donor agency for resources. This reliance has several implications, including that they had to highlight some of the deficiencies and problems that the sister survivors faced. This focus was also imbibed by the sister survivors. Findings from our study also highlighted the limited future prospects for the sister survivors. The organizations provided training in creating local handicrafts, but those handicrafts had very limited demand in the local market. The sisters also reported feeling pain when the NGO had asked them to recall their past for their donation purposes. During the interviews, the sisters also shared that they had concerns about the stigma present in Nepali society against trafficking survivors. In general, we find that the sisters are dependent on the organization, but at the same time, the organization is also quite dependent on the sisters to need their services. These initial findings influenced our approach moving forward. Because the deficiency perspective did not support the sister survivors' agency and power, we sought to build upon the skills and the strengths already available to the sisters instead. That is, by adapting an asset-based design approach. The sisters did not want to recall their past, so all of our methods focused on their present lives and their visions of the future. The interdependence between the organization and the sisters led us to develop ways to carefully balance multiple goals. We sought to include the staff members in all the decisions that we took. Based on the findings, we formed an evolving framework that guided our action. A focus exclusively on individual strengths would not suffice in changing the circumstances of the sisters in the shelter home. So we sought to establish the scope of our action to individual change, but also to institutional changes. To do so, we needed to reevaluate what assets meant, such that they went beyond the individual level and attended to more structural issues. We came up with a definition of assets that you see here that was associated with individuals' needs, their aspirations, and the structural realities in the ground. This definition also aims to push back on the more individual-centric neoliberal origins of asset-based community development work. Back to our framework, we noted that our actions can influence changes directly by engaging with the sisters, or indirectly by creating space for the sisters to reflect and use their assets. Within these dimensions, a component of our studies involved supporting the sisters to reflect on their assets and develop critical awareness. The question, though, is how can we design methods to promote reflection and support the sisters in identifying the assets that are available to them? Reflection requires a space where people feel comfortable and feel that they have control over their participation. However, my initial experience was quite the contrary. I, as a male coming from the US to conduct a research study in a primarily female setting, stood out. Further, I used words like project and research as part of the IRB consent process, which added to the distance. I felt like I was hearing some of their voices, but not completely. To promote comfort and to reduce the distance, I relied on the observations from my field studies. I had seen posters like these during my study of the organization. This suggested that the sisters were familiar with printed photos and posters for self-expression. So, building on that observation, I adapted the photo elicitation method. I hypothesized that the playful experience around photos would help reduce the distance while promoting reflection on their existing assets. Handing over an instant print camera, I requested the sisters to take photos they wanted for the next 2 days without establishing any particular goal. 2 days later, we convened to discuss all the photos they had taken. Instead of only the photographer speaking about the photo, everyone shared what the photos meant to them. At the end of the discussion, the sisters came up with a communally agreed upon statement to describe and summarize the photo and wrote it down on the poster, as you can see here. The study uncovered 2 elements of strengths possessed by the sisters. One was their crafting skills, and the other was their mutual bond. The next component involved supporting the sisters to use these assets and build capabilities towards broader possibilities and alternatives. And this is where most of my dissertation work happened. To do so, using our findings, we discussed the potential next steps with the staff members. In all of their suggestions, a technological component was present. We noted that the sisters also wanted to use technology, although they had never used it before. So considering the sisters' wishes as well as the NGO's preference for technology, we decided to move forward with computing. However, simply introducing computers had the potential to undermine the existing assets. Instead, I introduced computing in the context of the sisters' existing crafting practices. I presented a tailored web application that was contextualized around crafting, where the sisters could draw sketches or post details of their crafts. The sisters could also look at other people's crafts and leave audio comments on them. We hypothesized that contextualizing the web application around crafting would help in introducing computing, while also supporting the sisters to critically reflect on their existing assets. We also needed to think about design in a way that helped overcome barriers due to limited digital and text literacy. For this, I embedded voice annotation on all elements of this web application. But I did this differently than what's typically done in common technological systems. For example, phrases common in digital parlance like login and logout, which are also commonly used in Nepali websites, held little meaning to the sisters. Instead, we used familiar, elaborated phrases in the voice annotation. For example, instead of saying logout in Nepali, the web application said, to leave this technology, press here, like this. We presented this technology through a 10-day workshop and later replicated and extended it with another group of sister survivors. This was quite successful for both the sisters as well as the staff members. In fact, the staff members over time started asking us about the possibilities for the sisters to become computer trainers in the future. We extended the activity further and introduced the sisters to widely available systems like Google Search, Google Translate, and Wikipedia. Further, to situate their technological skills in the broader context, we introduced activities like future envisioning exercises, as well as discussion on societal problems, including the potential role they could play in tackling those problems using the assets that they have. All of this involves much nuance and was a slow incremental process, so please refer to the dissertation for details. The third component in this framework was on increasing inclusion within the organization to support the sisters in creating an asset-focused community. One way forward was to see if the sisters could play a greater role in the organization's operations, such as in the project design process. However, the staff members lacked confidence that the sister survivors could contribute, which again goes on to show how deeply ingrained the deficit-based perspective was within the organization. We slowly began pushing for small steps to begin including the sisters. One such approach led us to co-design a modified form of Snakes and Ladders, a game quite popular in Nepal, in which players make progress by sharing habits and practices. Within a playful setting, this creates opportunity for the sisters to share their knowledge, aspirations, as well as concerns about the future. It also encourages the staff members to support, reflect, and add to the sisters' knowledge. This work is ongoing and slowly moving forward. Hopefully, I'll get to share this learning in the next Kai. Through the engagement, we sought to build into methods the values that we wanted to achieve at the end of our engagement. This included seeking to promote multiple perspectives to emerge and enabling collective exploration. We designed activities both on and off the screen which supported the sisters to express their agency and have control over their level of participation. We designed our methods based on the local materials and practices and created avenues to highlight the sisters' strengths and assets across the organizations. We also used our position to push for small institutional changes. The framework and the definition of assets are contribution of this work. But the one key takeaway that I hope my work conveys is that we ought to see building relationship with communities as an end in and of itself. It is not just a means for research, and this requires care. I want to take the final moments to raise the need for us in Kai to reevaluate what counts as significant and productive. I want to push for Kai to evaluate technology in process, where we prioritize moving slow and building things. Relationship building requires balancing multiple tensions, and yet again requires us to move slow. Building trust is complicated, and so is finding alignment in the goals between what the community cares about and what is valued in academia. We also need to center reciprocity and mutuality in our engagement as we prioritize relationship building. All these, I think, have to be incorporated in our redefinition of significance and productivity. With that, I'll end my talk, and I'd be more than happy to discuss further. Thank you.
Hi, Akash. Great to see you again. I'm Azra from Georgia Tech, and really excited to see your work being recognized. I was wondering if you could speak a bit more about the kinds of institutional change that you felt like your work was able to push for. I was just curious about what that looked like and the extent really to which you were able to push for that within the organization.
Yeah, thank you. That's a really good question, and I couldn't cover it here. So we took very small steps and very slow steps. Initially, when we went in, the organization's beliefs was that the sisters could not use technology. And in fact, they had tried introducing computers before us through a 2-week-long session. And the sisters reported that they were overwhelmed with the experience. And so there was a lot of deficit perspective in the organization where they believed that the sisters couldn't do much with technology, let alone contribute to the organization's operations. As and when we worked with the sisters and showcased their assets with the organization, there was a shift in the belief. And we used that, we leveraged that shift in the belief by even small steps like putting up the 2 sessions of photo elicitation in the organization walls, which still stands to this day. And then showcasing their work with the web application as well as the further work with Google search and Wikipedia editing to the staff members, which, given in Nepal, like many of them value technological skills, was quite valued. So it brought in shift around like the future possibilities for the sisters. The organization started asking us whether we could get the sisters, train the sisters in becoming computer trainers in the future. So building further on that shift in belief, we started pushing for processes within the organization. For example, one of the core processes for the organization is to write a proposal for grants, right? It's a fundamental process for many organizations. So we started saying, what if we can have the sisters become like participants who give you data to tell you what kind of activities would be beneficial for people like them? And initially there was quite a resistance, which is what I presented, but slowly and over time, like right now the work is ongoing, and in fact in July I'm going back to Nepal to conduct the study. We see a shift where they are open to this possibility of including the sister survivors in the organizational's very core process. So in that sense, I see a lot of change in beliefs and practices, but yeah, it is a very slow process, right? The change in belief takes time, and in 5 years, that's not enough. Like we need 50 more years or something like that to make that change happen. But thank you for that question.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you.
I think we're good to go, yeah. Okay, great. I'll keep it short. And so celebrating the achievements and prestigious recognition of a PhD advisor is one of the proudest moments of any PhD advisor. So it's my great honor to present to you Dr. Fred Holman, a Georgia Tech alum, as our next Outstanding Dissertation Awardee. Yeah, out to you.
Thanks so much, Polo. All right. All right, so this is pretty wild because some of these slides that I made 3 years ago, this is the first time I've ever given a talk in front of a real audience with some of them. So it really is pretty fun to look back. But I'm so happy to share this work with you that I've done at Georgia Tech over the past 5, close to 6 years. And just like the others, I'm going to give you a summary of my dissertation work that largely deals with data visualization, machine learning, how those two things interact. But given the context of the award, it also gave me a chance to sort of reflect back on my process of the actual PhD. And because HCI is in the business of helping people, I thought, well, maybe there's others out there sort of struggling with the dissertation topic or where to go. So I want to end by actually giving some advice to other junior researchers and students that I think I really would have liked to have had when I was a student myself. But first, let's get to what you all maybe came here to see at the beginning. And to get started, I want to pose you all a little thought experiment here. On this first great day of Chi, think about how many different machine learning models you maybe have interacted with just today. If you do this, well, I did this for myself. Before I even woke up, my iPhone, unsurprisingly I have one, is doing this phone battery charging optimization to where it keeps your phone battery at 80% and then bumps it up to 100% right before you wake up to preserve your battery's health. I sent off a few text messages. I had to use my face to even get into my phone. Other services told me about notifications of when I need to go somewhere in order to arrive on time. Sent a few emails, there's smart composition, so on and so forth. You get the picture, right? Content recommendation, camera. There's all sorts of different stuff that we're interacting with that has machine learning powering some sort of experience. But as everyone here probably knows, machine learning is also this sort of dual-edged sword. And when things go wrong, it can be super annoying. For example, if that phone battery model doesn't work, I'm going to wake up, my phone's not fully charged for a day like today, that's going to be really annoying. I'm sure we've all had the circumstance of sending the wrong text message sometime. But more seriously, search results have been shown to spread misinformation. Social media newsfeeds can pigeonhole one's beliefs. In the case of health informatics, these can actually lead to life-threatening situations, things that we definitely don't want to have happen. And so the punchline here is that machine learning makes mistakes. And this is a fundamental difference that we need to think about when we're designing technologies and experiences that have machine learning powering them in the back. This duality is seen no better than if you just Google search AI is and look at the autocompletions. We get things like good and not good, and dangerous and not dangerous. There's this duality that's going on with a lot of machine learning in AI today. So how do we fix this? What's one way to fix it? How are we going to debug our models? Let's just look at machine learning from a super high-level perspective. We have data sets, and from those data sets, we train models. And one way to understand and debug models is to figure out what these models have actually learned. And that's what interpretability does. It asks questions like, what has your model really learned? And can you explain its predictions? But there's a bunch of other reasons why we may want interpretability, not just for model debugging. So to motivate this problem even further, there's a whole list of why we care about this topic, machine learning fairness. We want to ensure that models work across every single person who's using them. Scientists are using machine learning to understand things about our universe. Robustness, user control, user acceptance. These are all reasons for why we should care about studying interpretability. And throughout my PhD, I had an incredible, fortunate time to spend 4 summers at some of the world's greatest places, alongside artists, designers, developers, applying machine learning to some of the world's hardest problems. And from there, I had an observation that I want to claim to you all, that machine learning is a people problem. And so what do I mean by that? If we dig into that ML process a little bit more in depth now, before we even touch code, one of the first things we do is figure out, is machine learning appropriate for this problem? Is it feasible for this problem? This task formulation is done and framed by people. When it comes to data collection, cleaning, and labeling, these are all processes done oftentimes manually by people about data that's describing people. And then when it comes to modeling, people are the ones setting the parameters by which we train machine learning models, defining the metrics by which we deem them worthy, whether or not to deploy and then monitor. And so with some suggestive highlighting, you can probably see here that people are really at the core piece of every single stage of this machine learning process. And so when it comes to interpretability, I thought, well, things should be no different. We should understand what people need so we can design and develop the right tools for interpretability. And so that leads me to my research mission that I had throughout my dissertation, which very simply says to enable machine learning interpretability at scale and for everyone. And there's 3 important pieces here that make up the 3 large pieces of my dissertation, namely this emphasis on enabling, scaling, and then communicating. And to put these research challenges a bit more crisply, this first one is how do we empower people to interactively and visually explain machine learning models, both predictions and what they've learned broadly. Secondly, how do we make sense of large data sets and these super complex models like neural networks that have been taking over machine learning and all sorts of other areas over the past half-decade or so? And then lastly, let's make sure we don't forget about everyone else. How do we make sure that the broader public has some understanding of the capabilities and limitations of machine learning, sort of boost the literacy that's going on? And so I just want to speak to a few of the projects that go into each one of these different pieces of my dissertation. And let's start with this first one on enabling interpretability. If you go and look at all the different definitions, explicit definitions of what interpretability is, you'll see there's really no consensus. There's no single unified definition of what it should be or what it should mean. But yet people are still training models and still deploying models. So we thought, well, we should still try to figure out a way of helping people and making sure our models are as good as they could possibly be. And instead of defining yet another way of going about interpretability, we sort of sidestepped that and instead operationalized it and said, well, what should interpretability feel like? What should it look like? What should it support? What are the things that people actually want to do when it comes to understanding and explaining their models? And this paper, that was a CHI 2019 paper called Gamut and a follow-up called Telegam, really set the stage, and the biggest contribution here is this first formulation of what interpretability system design should be. What should interactive tools do and support to enable interpretability? This also set the stage for a number of future investigations and has influenced a number of really popular open source toolkits, which is great. So then secondly, given all that we learned from those first pieces of talking with practitioners, understanding their needs, how do we then bring those to larger models like neural networks, deep learning, all this vision and language stuff that's been dominant over the past decade, really since 2012? And we did the survey of all the visualization tools out there to support these type of tasks, and we noticed there was sort of one big blind spot. A lot of the tools for deep learning really emphasize explaining a single data point's prediction. So these local explanations is what we call it in the community. But none of them really look at the whole model, these global explanations, which is critically important to understanding what your whole model is maybe deciding or how it's behaving. And so we spent a number of years prototyping, and it took a while until the summit paper in 2019 to where we finally, we think we have a pretty awesome approach of using graphs as this underlying representation for looking at the entirety of a neural network, extracting a subgraph, and finding the pathways at which certain neurons activate in order to classify some number of images. But it's really great because it's super scalable, because it relies on aggregation approaches. So we can summarize thousands, tens of thousands of images in these single beautiful visualizations. If this sort of work sounds interesting, I encourage you to look at the summit paper. There's a live demo, and there's some really awesome graph-based visual visualizations and interactions going on there. So then lastly, this final piece on communication. As we were doing this work in the first two pieces, we had a couple of side projects that we were just sort of kicking along for fun. In the space of interactive articles and storytelling, you've maybe seen these things from outlets like the New York Times and Pudding, where you have interactive graphics and text, and they're sort of interleaved one another to tell some compelling story. We authored a few of these for machine learning and a couple of other topics, and we put it out as this project called the Parametric Press that we are super excited to see go viral at a whole bunch of different places. And we were able to learn a lot about how people read this type of content and how different affordances by which it can help people. And so with all those little side projects, they all sort of coalesced, and we thought, maybe we've hit on something a little bit bigger here. Taking our experience of publishing these at scale, we then looked to literature and said, well, what are all the different theories that support this type of medium of interactive articles as being a really awesome vessel for play and education? And so we authored this big work that sort of completes the thesis that's really the first synthesis and formalization of what interactive articles are and why you should be caring about them and taking a look. And we thought it'd be ironic to publish it as a static PDF. So the article is actually authored as an interactive article itself, so you can read about these techniques and then play with them directly in line, and it's published on Distill. Okay, so that's 5 years in 5-6 minutes or so. I want to spend my last few minutes thinking and reflecting on my time as a PhD student and maybe offering some advice to the others here. When I first started doing this, the first place I went was to look at this daily journal that I kept for over 5 years, one of the longest things I've probably ever done besides the PhD. And I started digging in and reading a bunch of entries. And first I was just blown away by the amazing experience that I've had, meeting people at Chi, getting married, loving the Georgia Tech computing community and my advisor Polo and the lab that he's built. But one thing that sort of stood out as I was going through back in time was this notion of how confident I was in my work and my thesis. I think when I started my PhD, I expected it to look something like this, where as time goes on, okay, 1 year goes by, I get 1 year smarter. Another year goes by, I get 1 year smarter. In reality, I think we all know it looks something more like this, where it really wasn't until, dare I say, year 4, where it felt like I knew all the names, I knew all the different papers, the problems, and you can really start to piece everything together and have something coherent at the end. This is also reflected if you plot all the papers that went into my dissertation over time, broken down by those 3 parts I just discussed. So here that is. As you can see, a lot of the action is only happening towards the back half of that time. And it was that second part on deep learning that we spent looks like 2 or 3 years prototyping until we finally got something that we were confident in that worked correctly. And so I have another version of this slide that steps through every one of these. That first purple block is actually a Chi late-breaking work from 2017, my first paper, a little poster that I'm still so proud of. But it's going to take way too long to explain. There's so many great little stories in here that I'd love to talk to you about if you're interested in. Okay, just a few more things here. So some other research reflections. Interdisciplinary work is super hard. I'm certainly not the first person to say this, and likely won't be the last. You have to learn multiple fields simultaneously, but sometimes you have this lack of belonging. People say are you a Viz person, an HCI person, a machine learning person? And you kind of have to say, well, I'm a little bit of everything, and that's not super satisfying of an answer. But I truly believe that this innovative, this work that sort of bridges communities is really the most innovative, and it's something that I'm super glad to be a part of. Another thing that feels a little cliche to talk about, and even maybe not as important as all the pandemic stuff that we've been dealing with, is imposter syndrome, which is something, oh, okay, well, we're going to get to that in a second. Something that I struggled with a lot, especially as I was reading over these entries. I think it's super prevalent in highly technical communities and research communities such as ours, and I just want to emphasize this and definitely reach out to junior students, because this is likely something that people are dealing with that you just have no idea about. When it comes to some inspirational reads, I also just want to, you should also just bookmark these things right now. Research Debt by Chris Olah and Sean Carter. There's few things that you can do in 5 minutes that'll change your life. This essay on communication will, I promise you. The second thing is K.R. Patel's Dissertation from 2012. So lucky to call him a colleague at Apple now. But I believe the ML tooling community is really still playing catch up to some of the ideas he had nearly a decade ago. Brett Victor's work on representation, a classic, and if you haven't seen it, just go and check out this link as well. You can watch it, play it, read it. It's kind of an amazing piece on itself. And then lastly, Salima Amershi's Model Tracker paper, a CHI 2015 paper, was one of the first mixed initiative systems that I read when I started graduate school, and super inspired and sort of transformed the way I look at how data viz can help do analytics and communication. All right, so my last slide, some final advice, things I've tried to compile over the years. This first one I still struggle with and still working on today, which is prototype often, prototype fast, and know when to reach for a pen versus code. If you can get an idea across in a sketch on a big marker on a big piece of paper, then just do that and be done with it and move on, do something new. But sometimes it can be super valuable to take a break, go to code and build up something in a day or two and have something for people to point at and poke at. You'll get a lot further. Impact has many forms. As someone who loves writing and loves publishing, impact doesn't always have to look like a 9-page PDF, and so I encourage you to chase impact, not papers. Find and work on real problems. The world has enough problems as it is to be inventing new ones and solving it 3 paragraphs later. Seek good mentorship and support. There's no way I'd be here without all the fantastic mentors I've had. Tinker on side projects to re-energize yourself. Anytime some of the main work that I was doing started to feel dull or burnt out, work on something new, and it totally just re-energized myself. And then lastly, I know we're all here to do rigorous science, rigorous design, and we want to talk about results, and aesthetics don't really come into that conversation too much. But I really do think that they matter, and I'd encourage you to make beautiful materials. People pay attention more, and they learn more, and if you don't believe me, there's a citation to back me up as well. Okay, great. So I think that's all the time I have. I have to say thank you to every single person who's been involved during my PhD. As you all know, it takes a village, and there's certainly a number of villages up here, from Polo, Alex, my advisors, all of Georgia Tech, the Visualization Lab, Polo Club, and all the different mentors I've had over the summer. I just want to thank you all so much for this. And please visit this URL. There's videos, demos, code, everything you'd want to know is up there. And please reach out to me after. I'm happy to answer questions. Thanks so much.
Hello, thanks for the wonderful talk. My name is Zishen. I'm a first-year PhD student at CMU HCII.
Great.
I wonder, for all the tools you build, you're intended to fit into the existing machine learning workflow to help people better build a model. And how do you make these fit into whatever the company or the developer is currently working on to integrate, to make sure that they adopt these tools that you have been building over the years?
Yeah, great question. So I can try to answer this quickly. The first part, a lot of the tools I built were looking at model evaluation. So given a trained model, how do we poke and prod it and understand where it's good, where it's bad? So most of my systems fit in that model evaluation piece towards the end of the process. But as you saw, there's a whole bunch of other things that still need work and tooling. There's a lot of emphasis on data. My Apple summer had a whole paper on looking about data over time and data changing, how that influences models. There's so many interesting opportunities outside of just evaluation to look at as well. The second question you had of how to get these integrated in a company or something like that, I think I need another 5 years so I can have some more advice on that. The thing I can only say is you can't just build something and throw it over a fence and expect someone to use it. You have to work with people and understand where they're doing their type of work in order to build a tighter relationship there. But I think I might need a few more years before I can come back and speak about that.
Okay, so we just discussed how we do that, because I think we are 10 minutes late, and there are videos sent in from the people who could not be here, and we have people who have to leave at 5:30, and so the idea is we flip it around, and then you can stay at the end for the videos that were sent in, and we take the time for the people who are here to talk to us, and yeah. And yeah, perhaps we should also introduce ourselves. My name is Albrecht Schmidt, and I'm from the University of Munich.
And is this on? I'm Gloria Mark, University of California, Irvine.
And we have the chance to introduce the people here. Yes. And sort of, yeah, we don't go through them, but I think we have two people here on stage. And yeah.
I'm Roel Vertigal. I work for Huawei.
I'm Marilyn Tremaine. I'm also known to SIGCHI as Marilyn Manti, and right now I'm at the University of Toronto, Computer Science.
Okay. So it is my pleasure to ask the first question from Marilyn. So Marilyn, you've had such a long and distinguished career, and by the way, you were at the EDS Capture Lab, right?
Yes.
And I was there too. It was my first job. I think I came after you. But I wanted to ask for, you've been in various positions. You've done so much great work. In fact, you're a co-founder of SIGCHI. What is the thing that you're most proud of in your career, or things, maybe more than one?
The thing?
Yeah.
Well, I think I'm one of these weird professors who wasn't interested in doing things to make myself famous. And this is a little embarrassing right now. I did it because I wanted to improve interfaces for people. I was just one of these empathetic people that, bang, I wanted to make everything work. And some of the things I did, like within SIGCHI, were to make sure that certain things were happening so that the field would move forward. And I wasn't interested in me so much as doing all that stuff. And I suppose that's kind of unusual, but it fits. Go ahead.
So I think this is sort of a real inspiration also when I looked at what you did. And I think this question, how do we really impact people? And I think we're at the moment discussing how to really get the knowledge the community creates out, that it really creates a change in the world. So what is your sort of short takeaway? How can we really make our work impact people out there, impact the websites we are using tomorrow to book a flight or whatever? How do we do that?
Well, some of the things I did were do the work behind something and get it all prepared, and then ask somebody else who was famous to run it. I did that with the doctoral consortium. I did that with a poster session. I did that. One of the other things that you do is, there was no SIGCHI interactions. There was no place to publish HCI stuff then. But that was okay with me because you wrote research that you published in the fields that you wanted to impact. So some of my work was published in information systems. Some of it was published in IEEE. I eventually started publishing in Chi, but we didn't have Chi until we created it. Right? So the issue was I wanted to make an impact on these people. One of the things that we thought about was where do we put the organization? And the decision was to put Chi well, SIGCHI in ACM. Why? Because those were the people you wanted to influence the most. And that's where it got arranged to be, and that turned out to be a good thing because it really succeeded. People feel very important belonging to ACM, and so we've attracted a lot of people.
Okay, so I start with you. So I think you figured out you had a joint past. I think I had sort of met Roel at I think he was a shepherd for one of our early CHI papers, and we didn't get on well. So I think it was really this thing where we were fighting over the content. And I think this is something, that's why I bring it up here. We're sitting here, this has not really impacted. We were fighting over the content, and I think in the end the paper went through and it was okay. But I think this is something which I think is a question for you. How do we get this sort of, that we dare to really sort of challenge ourselves, challenge our colleagues on a content, and are not getting into a way where we sort of just, we are afraid of challenging people. And I think you were never afraid of challenging people, but I think this is something which I really like, sort of, because that brings people forward. How do we do that?
It's a very good question. Yes, I'm very pleased to be here with Marilyn. She introduced me to Canada, and she's probably the reason I live there and spent 20 years there. So I'll be forever grateful for her involvement in my career. And I also wanted to say here to the last presenter, I think, you know, I'm deeply honored with this the SIGCHI Academy Award, and it maybe is, I can finally say, maybe I don't feel like an imposter anymore. We all do.
We all do.
But to answer your question, I think one of the things that is troublesome in society, especially in North America, but I think also in academia especially, is that it is increasingly difficult to be critical without being offensive. And I think one of the aspects of science that I've always held up high is that if somebody, if you can help someone by pointing out a potential mistake that they've made, whether or not it was a mistake is debatable maybe, but at the very least raise it, then you lose a cornerstone of science. So I think it's really important not just to criticize, but also to be open for criticism, and to not expect that the person that's doing that is doing you harm in the process. In fact, if a person is asking you a critical question, for example, if you've given a talk at CHI, they're doing you a favor. And that's how I've always seen it. It wasn't always interpreted that way, but it's when you are passionate about furthering a field, criticality is a huge part of that.
So I'm looking at the audience here, and I see so many young people, and so many of you are aspiring to be in the positions where Marilyn and Roel are. So let me start with Marilyn. What advice would you give to young people just starting out in HCI? And, you know, what would you advise them in their...
I wish you asked me that question yesterday so I could answer it today.
Oh.
I give different people lots of different advices because it depends on who they are. Mm-hmm. And I introduce them to different things depending on what they already know and believe in. Right now I'm working with a computer science student, and I want to teach them how to design experiments and run research, because computer scientists don't tend to do that. Their field is built differently. So I also try to bring the other fields in, and I try to get them to take multiple courses in different areas so they start to learn different things, because the field is really very interdisciplinary. And I'm going to take the last talk by the PhD winner, and I'm going to use that to the inspiration part to talk to the students again. But I have classic stories about different students because they come with different backgrounds. And one of the ones that is pretty famous is I have when my students go out for jobs and job interviews, I always make them come and give the presentation, and I want them to wear the clothes they're going to wear in the interview. And in the past, I've had lots of students from China, and I have to teach them that it's your ideas now. You don't have to listen to somebody you think is more important. Now you come up with the creativity. But I had one student in particular. She was incredibly Chinese. She worked very, very hard. And she wore these clothes that were very feminine. And she was going to be applying for jobs in the computer area. And I said, let's go shopping. And we went shopping for clothes you wear at an interview in North America. And then I said, why don't you get a haircut? And let me take you to the person who cuts my hair. And I paid for that because it was important for her to look right for the job she was interviewing for. Let me say now that she's department chair and relatively well known for the research she's done. I won't mention it because I know she's at this conference.
So I think we moved an advice question on to you. And I think also this question, I think a lot of people are still swinging between university and industry, but very few people have sort of done this back and forth. And I think I would even say three things, academia, industry, and entrepreneurship. And I think nowadays we see a lot of people focusing very much on, I can only do one because it's so hard. So what is your advice also taking people's careers forward? And I think you have done sort of all three. So what is the advice? What should we focus on if we have a limited time?
That's a difficult question. I think I've never really planned so much. You know, I started as a jazz musician. I went to Preservation Hall yesterday and saw some fantastic improvisation. You know, life is an improvisation, and I think so is doing research. You know, to quote Einstein, if you know what you were doing, then you wouldn't call it research. So life is the same way. You follow the path, not always the path of least resistance, but the path of most inspiration. You know, you meet people on your path, like in my case, I met Marilyn and I met Bill Buxton. And I was like, yeah, I'm going to start a lab like that. And so I went over to the next town, which was Kingston, and I started an interaction lab. And, you know, that wasn't something I planned per se, right? And then, you know, after doing that for 20 years, an opportunity came along. You know, I'm 53 now. If I want to work on some of the inventions that are now practical for product, I should do this now. And so now I'm doing that for Huawei, and I'm really enjoying doing that. In the meantime, I've also tried startups, and I think you should just experience life for all of what's worth. I can't give you a definitive answer.
So my favorite saying you just touched on, Louis Pasteur said, chance favors the prepared mind. And you really talked about that in your life.
And that's also true for invention.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I mean, I sometimes go into weird obsessions like quantum mechanics or whatever, and I just get really into things. And then 10 years later or 5 years later or whenever it might be, it ends up being work that enters my work. I find that really miraculous. So you have to have an open and prepared mind, yes.
And I suspect, Marilyn, because you've done so many different things, you probably also seized the opportunity when it came along. So you probably had also some of this notion of chance favors.
You're right. I've just grabbed at opportunities because this looked like fun. And it always was. I've always seen myself as incredibly lucky because my career is just one bang, 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 this way and that. And it was just because, oh, that looks like it's the way to do things. Let me do that.
But I will add that that doesn't mean you shouldn't have a plan at all. You know, I think, or at least a sub-plan, or maybe a plan B even. But like, for example, I've always made sure in my research, and I think I was relatively unique in doing that, I always created themes. So, you know, like I tried to create paradigms, like attentive user interface or organic user interfaces, not necessarily one invention or one thing, so that you can, if you have limited resources, which I did, you can make the knife cut so much sharper if you focus on one particular theme and then create sort of the 360 of that theme. In my case, it was doing the flexible phone, doing the foldable phone, you know, and whatever, doing the paper computer. And now these things all turned into products, largely without my doing. Although Huawei has a foldable phone called the Mate X, you know, that was inspired by my work. And I think it's just wonderful to see how all this just happens, you know?
Yeah. Sort of like a roadmap, right?
But there, yeah, some kind of roadmap, some kind of something.
Sometimes you just do things because they're there. You mentioned the capture lab. Well, I wasn't yet tenured at the University of Michigan, and I just left the tenure position and went to work at this research institute because of what they were doing. And it was just, I want to do that. That is so new, it's so unique.
Yeah, and I mentioned jazz before, but I really think that jazz is a perfect metaphor for structuring an organization that is doing research, like it might be a small research group or whatever. Like, I was watching the Beatles Get Back, and I recommend, if you've got 8 hours to spend watching television, this is some of the best hours you could spend, because you're seeing all the elements of creation happening there. There's different roles for different people. Not all of them are composers. Some try hard and some make it, like George Harrison in this particular case. There's politics, but there's also things like turn taking and having specialisms. You have a drummer, you have a guitarist, you have a bass player, and you have sometimes opportunities to perform, like doing a demo typically is an opportunity like that, like for a band, it's performing on a stage. But then there's also moments in the studio, which is when you prepare your research. I find there's so many parallels.
And I think before we go deeper into music, I would have another question about sort of basically being international. And I think sort of you have been from the Netherlands to Canada, now more China, and also you have been, we talked earlier, you have been to Germany at some point working. So, and I think this is something which basically, what are the skills you need? What is it you do to really become sort of an international scholar? And I think very often we say we publish on international conferences, but being an international scholar is something quite different. Perhaps we start with you?
Well, I can say the first international was going to work in Paris.
I met you there actually.
Yeah.
At Michel Baudouin-Lafon's lab.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah. I remember that.
Yeah. But this was before that, and I wasn't even educated yet. I was a programmer, and I went to work for the French gas and electric company. And what you first do is you listen to other people, and you learn culture. And it ended up that I was learning more culture than I was learning. They hired me because I spoke English, so they thought I could learn COBOL and do the programming, but that was trivial. But the French was much more exciting. And finally, I was met by the union, and they told me, "Don't turn out your code that fast, you make us look bad." So I slowed down, and I spent more time learning how to be French, and it was fantastic. I've always spent sabbaticals in another country, because they're exciting. One of the great places I went is Singapore, and I was there for a semester. And then again, I had to learn a completely different culture. Everybody says Singapore is all tied up in rules and run by the police, but that's not true at all. They just want you to think that, so you send all their boats over there, and they take away the trade from China. They want you to think they're so honest that this is a good place to be, and they are pretty much that. And you learn a whole bunch of things. Like I taught for a year and worked for a year doing research in outside of Munich, Germany, at the Technical University of Munich, and it was so much fun that I came back every summer for the next 10 years and taught a short course. And
I'm still in Munich, so.
Right. And of course, I moved to Canada. I went to Canada to a conference, and I said, this is a really good place. It's a good place to be, it's a good place to work. And I worked with the University of Toronto because I wanted CHI to become international, and I convinced them to run the CHI 87 conference, which started the international part of it.
Okay, so we have another minute on the international stuff for you, and then we have to wrap up.
Well, I think, just like with coding, you need to learn your languages. This would be my recommendation. Like, I mean, I don't know if you mind that I speak English with a Dutch accent, but it is something that I have tried to get rid of. I didn't even know you were Dutch. So, I think it's very important to not just speak the languages as they are spoken, but also to understand the culture and to appreciate how other people in other countries think. And if you can do that, that actually is very helpful in your research to begin with. And then you can work anywhere you like. Nowhere's perfect, and each country has its benefits.
And you have a Canadian accent, eh?
I do now, yeah.
Well, I really hope this is inspiring for the rest of you. We have, you know, I'm so honored to be here with these two Chi Academy winners, and I hope it provides some perspective and inspiration for the rest of you.
And I think now we have a few videos to be played, so if you can make the time, please do stay. And I think we get off stage because some people have to leave. And so we go off stage. Thank you so much for being sort of not prompted before, just answering our questions as they come. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for this award. It means a lot to me. I share it with all of my students and collaborators. Our work has always been risky, and I'd like to thank the people who took big risks on me, including Ed Chi and Pete Paroli, who took a risk on a graduate student with no papers, Bob Crowd and Sarah Kiesler, who took a risk on a postdoc with almost no papers, HCII for providing the space for us to take big risks, and my family for always supporting me throughout them. In the next 90 seconds, I'm going to try to sum up everything I've learned in my career. Here we go. Let's start by looking at the last 10,000 years. Human progress has been driven by our unique ability to accumulate and recombine information in ways. But looking at the next 10 years, the problem is that information is growing exponentially, but our brains are not. It's becoming increasingly hard to make sense of information and innovate new science and technology. So if we look at the human mind, it distributes information across many different areas. And if we take this to the internet, we can distribute thinking across many minds and machines. And by doing this, we can scale up thinking and build on each other's work instead of it being lost, like a knowledge accelerator. We've explored 3 architectures for a knowledge accelerator. The first is through online communities like Wikipedia, the largest encyclopedia of human knowledge. And what we've learned is that you can't just throw a million people together and say go. You need leaders to scaffold them. And when you do, the results can be amazing. Limitation here is that volunteers will only do what they're intrinsically motivated to do. So next we looked at paid crowdsourcing as an architecture for knowledge acceleration. The key challenge here is how do you do big picture thinking when everyone only sees a small piece? We and others have found ways to do this, where many people mediated through AI effectively play the role of leaders. Limitation here is money, both in terms of getting the work done, but also the ethics of doing piecework. One question we've asked is there a future of crowdsourcing where you'd be proud to have your children grow up to be crowd workers? Finally, the architecture we're exploring now is distributed sense-making. We're each making sense of the web, all doing lit reviews or planning trips. We spend about 1 trillion hours a year that we're currently throwing away. Can we build new browsers that help us to make sense while externalizing our minds so that others can benefit? The key challenge here is incentives. How do we create a system that's useful both for me doing the initial work, but also for you in deciding whether to use it? Come back to me in a few years as we discover the limitations here. I hope some of you may build on our work and discover new architectures that will accelerate knowledge even further. Thank you again for this award and for listening.
Good evening, everybody. Greetings from Frankfurt. My name is Norbert Streitz, and I'm very honored to be inducted into the Kai Academy, especially also because I'm one of the very few Germans receiving this award. Since I will not be present at the award ceremony, I was asked by SIGCHI to provide some examples of my research achievements in this video. First of all, I'd like to thank my students and the members of my different teams, because they were essential and contributed to the successful work during all these years. Furthermore, my thanks go to the different collaboration partners in fascinating projects in multiple parts of the world. I was very fortunate to have the freedom to set up interdisciplinary teams. This was and still is very central to me, probably also because I have a PhD in physics and a second PhD in cognitive science. When applying my cognitive science research on human problem solving and knowledge representations to real-world issues, I became very interested in human-computer interaction. A major inspiration were my early conversations with Don Norman during my visit at UCSD in La Jolla in 1984. At that time, HCI was a very new field. In Germany, we called it software ergonomics, and in 1985, I became the first elected chair of the special interest group Software Ergonomics in the German Society for Computer Science, which is the equivalent to SIGCHI in ACM. Me and my group at the Technical University Aachen were employing a cognitive ergonomics approach for the design of user-centered interactive systems. I think that my work on mental and conceptual models of users and designers will become relevant again in the current discussion on human-centered AI, especially explainable AI. In 1987, I moved from Aachen to Darmstadt for the newly established Integrated Publication and Information Systems Institute, IPSI, part of GMD, later merged with Fraunhofer, being a division manager and a deputy director. My new research area was hypertext and hypermedia, and we developed, for example, the cooperative hypermedia system Sepia with typed nodes and links long before the World Wide Web appeared on the scene. Another influential experience was my stay as a visiting scholar at Xerox PARC in 1990, when Mark Weiser wrote his seminal article, The Computer for the 21st Century, and created the field of ubiquitous computing. I had the privilege to see and interact with a still secret liveboard prototype. Based on a cooperation with PARC, we developed CSCW systems like, for example, Dolphin, for local and distributed electronic meeting rooms in IPSI. Me and my Ambiente Research Division are probably best known in the Kai community for our roomware components, interactive and connected tables, walls, chairs, lecterns, and the Beach software realizing new interaction paradigms. Altogether, they constitute Island, an interactive landscape for creativity and innovation. With Island, we built in 1998 a truly ubiquitous multi-device computing environment, which serves as a blueprint for future smart or cooperative buildings, winning also several design prizes and research awards. Being at the forefront of ubiquitous computing and ambient intelligence in Europe, I became instrumental in defining and setting up the EU-funded proactive initiative, The Disappearing Computer, consisting of 55 institutions collaborating in 17 projects, chairing the steering committee and managing also some projects myself, like ambient agoras. Our research addressed the extension from individual smart artifacts to integrated collections, constituting smart rooms and smart buildings, or as I prefer to call them, cooperative buildings, moving towards urban environments. Currently, I'm the scientific director of the Smart Future Initiative, founded in 2009. The focus is on citizen-centered design of current and future urban environments like smart cities and airports, and more recently also smart islands. Designing for humans requires to move beyond smart-only cities towards humane, sociable, self-aware, and cooperative hybrid cities. The approach is determined by redefining what I call the smart everything paradigm, which is my perspective on human-centered AI. A recent activity addresses issues of smart islands, where I enjoy working together with my wife, Christine, an expert in innovation and change and participatory design. Check out our paper in the upcoming May-June issue of Interactions. Let me thank you again for this award and being part of the Kai community. I wish you all a relaxing fireside chat and the celebration of the awards. Take care.
Thank you for welcoming me into the SIGCHI Academy. I'm deeply honored to join many of my academic heroes as a member. My research falls at the intersection of information retrieval and human-computer interaction, and I think that's a really interesting place to study, because what people are really doing when they search for information is thinking. And much of my research centers on the fact that computing technology doesn't merely support thinking, but actually shapes it. And the rapid global shift to remote work that we all experienced in March 2020, it was terrifying. But it created an opportunity for computing research to fundamentally shape the most significant change in work practices that any of us have seen in a lifetime. And there's a lot of opportunity with this. There's also a lot of risk. And I think it's incumbent on the Kai community in particular to really lean in and ensure that the future of work is meaningful, productive, and equitable. Visit the New Future of Work Initiative site to explore some of the significant body of research that's starting to emerge in this space. So, in addition to the SIGCHI Academy, this spring I was also inducted into the SIGIR Academy. And with that, I joined Susan Dumais and Marty Hurst as the only members of both. I first met Marty in the spring of 2000 when I sat in on a course that she taught on information visualization and information retrieval, and her research mentorship and even fashion advice has been foundational to my work ever since. Sue, I first met in 2003 at a SIGIR workshop that she organized on implicit measures of user preference. And then I interned with her at Microsoft developing algorithms for personalized search, and later joined her at Microsoft Research, where we eventually managed to ship some of the very first personalized search experiences to the world. I feel really fortunate to have so many great mentors in the SIGCHI community. Mary's in this picture as well, for example. And I really thank you all for always welcoming and supporting me, and I look forward to the future we're going to create together.